for a short presentation and comment from Chris T.O. and this will be taken after the confirmation of our previous minutes. Look, we'll look to do regular breaks. Online is actually more difficult than a meeting face to face, certainly for the administrators and the chair. So we'll look to break regularly. So just to, as the government says, stretch your legs and also to just get a small break. If we are continuing through till 12 p.m, we'll look to break for an hour at lunchtime then. All right, to our agenda paper, councillors, our order of business. Number one is apologies, and I have received an apology from Councillor Petrinas. Everyone else is present, so I'll look to move those, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. And this will be a good test. I'll now put it to the vote. All those in favour?
Aye.
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 Well done. That is passed unanimously. A little bit like citizenship ceremonies there, but well done, councillors. We now go through to the notification of any additional items. I have received none, and I'll just ask the meeting if there are any additional items. There being none, we'll move through to number 3, which is declarations of interest, if any. Again, I haven't received anything from my councillor colleagues. From the floor, from the meeting floor, is there anything? There being none. Right, we'll move through to the confirmation of our minutes from the 4th of August 2021. Councillors, the papers there are on page 7, council papers. And it's confirmation of the minutes that the minutes of the ordinary meeting of the 4th of August 2021 be confirmed as a true and correct record. Again, I'll look to move those, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Are there any matters arising? There being none, we'll look to move those, councillors. So again, with voice and show of hands, all those in favour?
Aye.
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 Well done, in chorus. That is passed unanimously. Right, we now move through to our presentation or comment from Chris T.O. Welcome, Chris. You have 10 minutes. You are well versed in submitting to us, so you know the procedure. The audience is yours. Welcome, Chris.
Yep. Are you able to hear me? Yep. Okay, great. Thanks. Is the audio volume suitable? Yep. Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much, Grant, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for letting me have this time to speak. I'm speaking on behalf of the Water Protection Society. It's almost 10 years to the day in September 2011 when I alerted colleagues, many of you were amongst them, to the fact that the wastewater treatment plant was failing to protect life in the Manawatu River by causing too much periphyton to grow. It has taken a really long time to reach this point. Recently, some well-known performers who were recounting the history of Palmerston North said that they thought Palmy was a bit shit. You have the very good fortune now to be able to make a decision that will put the lie to that view and leave a forward-looking legacy for the city. But if you make the wrong choice, they'll have cause to say, it's not just a bit shit. Do it once and do it right. Please don't be like previous councillors who have repeatedly made decisions that were quite predictably turned out to be unsatisfactory, just as some of the current options are. I can recall discussions about the using coastal land in the 1990s when the previous upgrade of the plant was required. Financial considerations were given priority and we ended up with the so-called solution failing to meet requirements after not even 10 years. We need to look long-term and to think of the values of people now and the way those values are changing. The overwhelming view is that public health and environmental health are top priority. This was borne out by both consultation exercises, whether people favoured discharge to the river, to the land, or to the ocean. In essence, to be true to those values means getting our wastewater out of the river to the greatest possible extent. But that shouldn't mean discharging to the ocean instead. The results of the first consultation are highly suggestive of people in general opposing discharge to the ocean, with 64% of respondents ranking that option either 5th or 6th, and only 11% ranking it 1st or 2nd. Additionally, ocean discharge is opposed by iwi to a similar level to that with which they oppose discharge to the river. It would be really ironic for you to propose 2 seats on this council to be for representatives chosen only by iwi, but then to ignore the values consistently and strongly expressed by iwi regarding wastewater discharge. On top of this, there is no appetite amongst neighbouring councils to be part of an ocean discharge scheme, given that they have already invested millions in land-based schemes in recent years, leaving Palmerston North as the local exception. Getting as much wastewater out of the river as possible without putting it into the ocean then requires discharge to land. And yes, there have been some problems with some systems where land discharge has been used. Where problems have occurred, they have nearly always been due to using too little land for the void to be discharged, and the schemes being managed by engineers instead of by experienced land users. We need to learn from mistakes and the positive outcomes to develop and manage a predominantly land-based system. I know for some of you, financial cost is possibly an important consideration, but for the public, it's way down the rankings of what is most important. And remember, whatever option is chosen, some of the money spent on it will be spent locally and have positive flow-on economic effects. Options involving purchase of land and setup of irrigation equipment is likely to result in more money recycling through our local economy than those options just involving big pipes and a discharge to the river or the ocean. Apart from during the initial construction period, the options involving predominantly discharge to river or ocean offer no economic benefits other than those arising from enabling economic activity that generates wastewater to continue or to be increased. But all of the land discharges have that feature as well. Economic benefits could be increased for any of the land-based options through innovative integration of the discharge with perennial biomass crop production. Matching the crop type to the variation in soil type and the drainage characteristics, and coupling the production with nearby bioenergy plant and greenhouse complex would result in many and varied ongoing jobs, including maintenance, crop husbandry, engineering, greenhouse food production, composting, education, tourism, and others. It could actually bolster the community where the land is located. And using a variety of plant species would also enable a steady stream of biomass to be produced and economic activity undertaken from early on, rather than needing to wait 25 to 30 years to harvest pine trees. I'm sure if all of you have heard that we in the Manawatu in New Zealand and in the world are in a climate emergency. Water quality is really important and certainly affects our enjoyment of life and occasionally our health, but climate change affects our very existence. Consequently, we believe that your decision should put considerable weight on the ability of different options to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions. And it's evident from the options involving predominantly discharge to river and ocean that they have negligible capacity to contribute positively in this way. They simply involve throwing the resource away. In contrast, the predominantly land discharge options have considerable potential from several sources. One, the land won't be used for ruminant animal production, although to achieve that benefit it's important that the land is not just used to grow grass that can be fed to extra cows on other land. And another is the fossil carbon that could be replaced by coupling perennial crop production to bioenergy production. Perhaps that could fuel the city's buses. And another is the carbon that could be tied up by growing plant species that could be turned into biochar that has a residence time of 600 years or so before that carbon is released. One of the deficiencies of the proposed land discharge options is that none of them include a front-end treatment wetlands component, given that the long-term proven ability of these wetlands to substantially decrease dissolved nitrogen in wastewater has been proven, and it's at relatively low cost. The project was aimed at stopping our wastewater from harming life and negatively affecting the spiritual values of the river. Continuing to pour all or most of it into the river will fail to fulfill that overarching goal. Yesterday, I provided you with my view on the extent to which the various options meet the different project objectives, and I hope you've had time to read that. Today, I haven't dived into the detail of the proposals and reports, even though there's plenty that I could disagree with in them. There are tables and tables of rankings, and they're all nicely coloured to make it easy for you to digest, but actually it would be a mistake to conclude that they represent a high level of objectivity. In the end, it comes down to values. What your values are and whether they represent the values of the people that you are meant to be representing. So I ask you to reflect on this and whether your decision will reflect the values of the people of the city, especially those of the younger people who will have to live and for the consequence of your decision for very much longer than most of us. Look, I thank you very much for your time and wish you well in your decision making. Thank you, and welcome any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate your comments. Well thought out, and the paper that you circulated yesterday. Look, councillors, we still have a couple of minutes left. Are there any questions of Chris and his organisation? If you can just let me know in the chat bar, please. Councillor Dennison, you had your hand up there.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just maybe not a question to Chris. So if there's others specifically to Chris, I had one more in general. If you want to come back to me.
Sorry, so you have a question on this or not?
Just through you, Mr. Mayor, just around, is this forming a deputation, or was this part of the report group of the BPO?
No, this was a presentation that, as the chair, Chris had asked at a number of different committees, and because they've been cancelled, I allowed him to speak because it is an important subject. So, understanding orders, I'm entitled to do that as chair.
Understand that, but would there be any other requests from the likes of the Peter Wells, who was part of the Food and Fibre stakeholder group, or any others that were declined? No, they weren't declined. They didn't ask. In saying that, I've had multiple discussions with Pete last night. So yeah. Just for transparency, I just wanted to understand how one individual or group can have time at this meeting or this formal council meeting over any other group that may not have had that opportunity.
Well, I suppose they need to understand the system and being able to. I mean, all the others, including iwi, had an opportunity to come and speak, and they haven't taken that opportunity.
It's a little bit extraordinary to have a speaking time at a council meeting. Would you agree?
Not really. Understanding orders with an important agenda item, and we are in difficult, interesting times of COVID. So, look, I'm going to put an end to the conversation now because the decision's been made. Chris has had his say. Are there any other further questions of Chris?
Thank you.
Are there any other further questions of Chris?
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wondered if Chris, to many of us in his various roles, I wanted just to ask him to explain who the Water Protection Society is and how that group came to be involved in this process. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. The Water Protection Society has existed since about 2014, when I was actually still on council, and it's been involved with 6 or 7 wastewater discharge plant consents around the region, ranging from Whakapapa to Ekatuna, Fielding, Fox and others. So it's got a long history of involvement in exactly this sort of issue. It's got about 50 members. It strives to ensure that as much wastewater is used as beneficially as possible, treating it through Papatuanuku, the earth, and getting good use out of it. Don't know if that answers the question sufficiently.
Great. Well, there are no further questions. Thank you, Chris, for your comment. And councillors, we will now move on to the report side and the big part of our meeting, which is on page 13 of your council papers. It's around our wastewater best practicable option, the final assessment and BPO selection. We have significant amount of background papers there, but we have a report paper, a memo from our Chief Engineer, Robert Van Bentum. All the appendices have been circulated and attached under separate cover. I'll now invite Robert, and I'm unsure, Robert, if there are others. Yes, I think there are. Our technical team will be online as well. The chair of the BPO group, David Warburton, our project manager, Milena Voss, Peter Lothran from Stantec, and Oscar Redro from Simpson Grierson. We also have other experts available online to answer any of the more technical type or legal type questions as well. So, Robert, I'll hand, and David, I'll perhaps hand over to you. Thank you.
Morena, Grant and councillors, yes, thank you for the invitation. So each of the participants, so my name's Robert Van Bentum, Chief Engineer, as Grant said, for council. Each of the presenters will introduce themselves, but we'll have a number of people talking to the report. So the report we've tabled, we prepared a presentation, PowerPoint presentation, which we'll work through to explain how we've arrived at the technical team's recommendation. So I'd just invite David Warburton, as chair of the project steering group, to make some opening comments.
Thank you, Robert. Grant, your worship, the mayor, councillors, thank you for the opportunity. It's interesting to do this under lockdown, and probably a challenge for all of us in terms of being able to work through such a complex matter. You've had a huge amount of material over a number of years now. This has been a 3 to 4 year project that's been driven pretty much entirely by the council's vision and objectives that were set out by council right at the beginning in terms of achieving the desired outcomes and the criteria. In a sense, I've reflected on the time, and it's sort of like a painting. We've had broad outlines, and as we've got closer to this date, we've actually been filling in more and more of the detail. And that's pretty much what we're getting today, is a lot more of that detail that's coming through. And today's detail is really set up to help you to make the final decisions in 10 days' time or so at your next meeting. The council has invested a lot in this process, and I would have to say that it's one of the most comprehensive options assessments I've ever been involved in, and has involved a very wide range of expertise: sciences, engineering, legal, planning, financial, cultural, plus, of course, a huge amount of stakeholder and community discussion, meetings, and feedback. The other aspect of this that I think the council should be particularly confident in is that virtually every aspect of this work has been independently peer reviewed by other experts in the field, whether that be land application, treatment plant design, planning requirements, financial costings, have all had more than one lens over it from completely different sources to come up with the positions that we're in now. So from that point of view, this is a more than a robust process. And I think the team has worked collaboratively to try and bring to you a full reflection of the issues and the challenges in the decision making. This doesn't make it particularly easy because there are pros and cons in so many of the options, and there are variations in all of them that we have to work through to come up with a good solution. I'm also conscious that you are in a particularly difficult position, as we are by default, in terms of making this decision in very much an environment of change. You will all be aware that there are new freshwater standards coming through the system. There are new land application requirements coming through. There's a new awareness of micro compounds, microplastics, and other variables in the waste that were never part of any waste treatment analysis 2010, even 5 years ago. There's new water regulations coming through. There's new regulations in the RMA. There's pending changes with government reforms, etc., etc. So this puts you in a challenging position, and I think it then is important to just put into context that what we're really saying here is that we still believe that council has a responsibility legislatively and probably morally to actually establish what the council feels is the best for Wanganui, Palmerston North. I'm sitting in Wanganui. And from that point of view, it's important that we actually work through that process so that the council can say what they believe to be the best for the city, and then we can move forward on that basis as we're required to do. It's an opportunity to, as we've already heard, set the ground for the future in terms of what we really want it to do. Milena has done an amazing job as the project manager, as is the rest of the team, in bringing this together in a very diverse way over a 3 to 4 year period. This material will be presented to you now. Milena will sort of, shall I say, act as the coordinator, but we're going to ask Oscar first from Simpson Grierson to set the legal settings so you understand where we sit statutorily, and then Robert's going to come in and just remind you of the range of options that we were going through to do the final assessment on the 11 really key options. And then Milena will work through the BPO process at the end in terms of how we got to where we are. And then with your agreement, Mr. Mayor, we'll hand it back to you to manage the questions, because I think that will be the easiest way to do it given the council protocols. So if you store your questions up on the way through, I think that will be easier. Otherwise, we might get ourselves a bit bogged down with the number of people on the call. So with your agreement, I suggest we work through that. And unless Milena wants to add anything at this point, I would hand over to Oscar and ask Milena to put the presentation up.
That's cool. I will put the presentation up. I will just cover off very to the point what we're covering in this presentation, just for clarity. A moment. So as we said, BPO independent chair was going to present. Then we're going to have Oscar just outline around the RMA consent decision making and the commitments that were required legislatively. I'm then just going to give the overview of the assessment process, the wider considerations, and then the technical specialist's recommendation. And as I said, we've got our experts there that can help discuss any of the detail that's in the documents that you've read. So over to you, Oscar.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you for your time this morning, and nice to speak to you all. Apologies from my colleagues Matt Conway and Patrick McNamara, who are both in other meetings this morning. The three of us and another colleague, Hitler have been doing the bulk of the work supporting Milena and her team throughout this process, particularly around consultation requirements, as David mentioned, reviewing all of the reports, particularly from and legal perspective, and then a lot of my focus here today is going to be on the decision-making requirements that you as a council now have to meet. I understand that you've been provided with a memorandum dated 10th of August that Matt and I produced for the council. So I'm going to speak to that a little bit, but the highlight points are up on the slide there. The council's current wastewater consent, and we'll get to this shortly, is due to expire, and essentially the council needs to be in a position where it applies for a new consent by June of next year. The RMA and the consents under it as it currently stands is the law of the land, as it were. And obviously important in all of this is Horizons as the regional council. We've engaged, I should have mentioned, one of the other big things we've been helping Milena and her team with is a submission process to the one plan change for Horizons. Basically, that was around some of the stuff that Chris mentioned earlier around discharge to land and trying to keep that option as open as possible. And that's essentially because Horizons are the regulator and the enforcer in this area. And currently, this BPO decision, we're a couple of months overdue for it. Because, again, as David mentioned, there have been extensive work done in the space, and the point we've got to here has meant a bit of a delay. So being in breach of that consent means that it's kind of up to Horizons whether and when they can take enforcement action against the council. And there's been obviously a lot of talk in this area about Three Waters reform. The important thing to note here is that the Three Waters stuff is proposals at this stage, and I think from the signals we're getting from central government, we can be fairly confident that something's going to change in the area. Timing dependent, obviously leading into the next central government elections. But as long as these things are proposals that are being consulted on, they're not something that the council can or will be expected to comply with. What the council needs to comply with is the RMA and its current requirements, including the consents issued under it. Milena, do you want to move on to the next slide? All right, so the key condition in the current consent that the council holds is 23C. That was entered into the consent as part of a change in consent process in 2015. And the key things there are those dates, June 2021, which I've mentioned, and June 2022. So that 2021 date is what we're looking at today in terms of selecting what the council considers to be the best practical option. And then once council's done that, the team's going to start putting all of the work that's been done so far into preparing a consent application. If we were to seek a further delay to those dates, our advice to the council so far, pushing that June date to, where are we now, late August, probably isn't the sort of breach of consent that would warrant going through the process of a change in conditions. But the longer that these things get pushed out, the more reason there would be to seek a change in conditions. And then that would essentially be the same sort of process as applying for a consent. You'd look at and this is covered in a bit of detail in our memo from a couple of weeks ago, but you'd be going through all of the assessment of objectives, policies in the one plan, as well as the effects of the wastewater discharge itself, and then also considering views in support and opposition to such a change in consent conditions. And stakeholders that Milena and her team, such as iwi, we definitely expect would be opposed to such an application. And just touching on the Three Waters reform, again, given that those are central government proposals, and it's about a broader restructure of the entities that manage wastewater, not about the environmental effects of a wastewater discharge. We don't think that that proposed reform would be considered a relevant consideration if consent conditions, if we were looking to change those, such as to push this decision back or to push the date for which councillors to apply for consent back. If Horizons were to back to Three Waters and to their decision making, we think there'd be a bit of quite a significant risk of legal challenge, and that comes back to the parties that would be likely to oppose such an application. I think there's one more slide, Milena, is that right? Thank you. So I think most of this I've covered off. Oh, sorry, back one. Thank you. So yeah, that the issue again. I mean, we are in a position in terms of selecting the BPO where we're overdue for that, and the longer that goes on, the greater there is a risk that Horizons would get considered to be warranted. David's already touched on the significant investment that has been put into getting us to this point where you've got all the information in front of you to decide what you consider to be the best practical option, taking into account the recommendations and the peer review and so on. And once that decision's made, we're back into being compliant with the consent, or I should say at least with condition 23C of the consent. Obviously, there's always ongoing things to make sure that the environmental impacts of the discharge comply. And then it's working towards hitting that June 2022 date in terms of applying for a consent to maintain that compliance. And one last comment, bringing this back to the Three Waters reform. One of the things, and I think this has been somewhat guided by the objectives of council that's been considered, is how whatever decision council makes here would integrate into a regional scheme. And so the intent there is, and obviously the Three Waters reforms come later, but whatever happens down the line with Three Waters, the options that are in front of you are, and technical experts will be able to speak to this much better than I can, will be in a place to integrate with the sorts of things that the government, and this also relates to the funding point. The funding point in terms of what central government's talking about, funding support for councils, the investment that the councils put into this BPO process. Again, we're talking about government proposals here, but what we expect is that that'll be recognised as well as we transition into a new Three Water system, when assuming that it happens, when that happens. So I think that's everything that I wanted to cover off at a fairly high level today. I'll be around for the meeting going forward to cover off any questions that come up that touch on legal matters. But I see that there are a few hands up for questions. So unless Milena, there was anything you wanted me to cover off first, I'm happy to take questions.
I think we're going to.
Sorry, could I just interrupt there as chair?
Sure.
I do have a question myself because I'm just unsure. Oscar, thank you for your words there. Just under condition 23C of the consent, you spoke about the missed deadline of June 2021, and we know that why that's happened because of ongoing iwi engagement and COVID, of course. It's very easy to forget that, although it shouldn't, being on this meeting. And you spoke about enforcement from Horizons being a possible condition, yet I understand there has been written confirmation from Horizons to our council that they are okay with the extension I just want you to confirm that if that's.
Mr. Mayor, can I speak to that one, please?
Who's this speaking? Sorry. Oh, okay. Yes.
Because of various issues that we're going through at the moment, I spoke to Horizons. We have a written permission to extend our BPO process until the 1st of September. Given the current constraints, I've subsequently spoken to Horizons and advised them that we might be closer to mid-September, and they've said that they've advised their team of that, and they've said that that's within the bounds of where we had aimed for. So we do have written permission to extend that 1st of June to 1st of September, and we also have tacit permission to take a little bit longer because of the issues that are currently surrounding us. Through the chair.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I suppose that, Oscar, that clears that up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Sarah can speak to that and the engagement with Horizons far better than I can. The point I would make is that it's in Horizons' discretion what enforcement action they take. Sorry, and so at this stage with that confirmation, we can be sure that at least over the coming month, there's no risk of that.
Right. All right. Thank you. Hands have gone down, so I'll pass back to you, Milena. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Real issues with this thing changing. Sorry. So just to move on in terms of context again around alternatives assessment, we are in an RMA process, which you've all heard probably over 1,000 times now. We've had our technical specialists. So there's a number of things that we've done through this process in order to ensure we've got a robust alternatives assessment. And our legal team have peer reviewed the processes we've adopted for our assessments, and they've been involved with reviewing more recent documents, but we've also involved peer reviewers from the technical space, which David's talked about now. The options development and assessment reporting has been an iterative one, and there have been workshops and peer reviews, as I've said, which is allowing us to sort of capture, lift up stones, find information that may come up down the track, and ensure that we've got, a complete package there in every aspect that we've been working through. And as I said, our legal advisors have been involved with that methodology and process. We've had our peer reviewers who are also experts in the sector, as David's alluded to. We've involved iwi at a governance, but also at a technical and assessment phase in terms of developing up the options and this process we've just worked through. And we've engaged with stakeholders and community extensively. So I just wanted to recapture that before we get into a little bit more detail. So I'm just going to pass over to Robert to share this presentation. Robert's going to talk us through, just very briefly, the shortlisted options for clarity.
Thanks, Milena. So look, I suppose just by way of opening comment, these 11 options are essentially the ones that have come forward through the process, but they have been amended, they have been refined, they've been adjusted as we've identified particular issues or we've identified particular challenges. So they are the same 11 that we considered nearly a year ago, but with alternatives. They do not represent all of the possible permutations. They're intended to represent meaningful alternatives with across the full range of receiving environments. So there are, of course, many permutations, and any option that goes forward as a BPO will itself be subject to further refinement and further adjustment. So, they are essentially for the purposes of a comparative assessment. So looking at the 11, we start with option 1, which was still is the 100% to river at the highest level of treatment. We move right through to 11, which is essentially 100% to ocean, although there is a small discharge to the river, which is really around optimizing the size of a pipeline. So it's ensuring that we don't have to build an extremely large pipe for a very small number of events. So those 11 options, some of them have discharges which shift from one receiving environment to another. So initially, for instance, we might be discharging to the river, and then at some point we discharge to the land. Others have a split discharge where we might be discharging to a number of environments at the same time. So working through the options. So then option 2, essentially all of these percentages are recording what we call duration. So they're the time of discharge to a particular environment. They're not necessarily the volume that is discharged over the year. So option 2 is 77% of the time we are discharging 100% to the river, but for 23% of the time we are sending some to land, 75% to land. That's below half, what we're calling half median, and 25% still going to the river. So there's a split between those two environments for 23%. Option 3, a little bit more complicated again. This is where we've got the two river discharge locations. So 57%, just over half, we're sending everything to the river at Totara Road. For the remaining 43% of the time, we're going down to a discharge point at Opiki. And there at Opiki, a further 20%, we're going all the time to the river at Opiki. But for 23%, we're doing a similar split, 75-25% to land and river. So 75% we're out of the river going to land, and that's typically the lowest flow period. So those are, again, the period below half median, what we call 37 QMEX, 37.5 QMEX. And then options 4, 5, sort of 6 and 7 are around. So 4 and 5 are the literally 100% to land, although we left in this very exceptional small number of days, again around the sizing of infrastructure, sizing of pipes. In a small proportion of the time we would discharge at Totara Road on those very wet days. So 4 is inland located sites. 5 is again the coastal land to sand country. Option 6, we again move to a more of a split between land and river here. So we've got a 53% of the time we're going to land, and the balance of 47, we're back to the river again. In each case, for option 6, 7, 8, and 9, we're going to the river at Totara Road, and we're piping the wastewater to the particular land area, either inland or coastal. So those are options 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then 10 is another one of these sort of hybrid options. Just under half of the time we're going to the ocean for 100% of the time. And for the other 50% of the time, largely, we're going to a split between ocean and land. So we have half the flow going to the ocean and half going to coastal land. So, I mean, those essentially, they're the options. As I say, there has been some change to the land areas and through the process latterly, because there's been accommodation of additional higher growth predictions. So that's resulted in some upscaling of land areas, and you'll notice that that's reflected in the summaries. So all of these options are explained in more detail in the first of the appendices, which was added, which was provided as one of the attachments. So yeah, that's probably me, Milena, in terms of that. So this graph here is really displaying this percentage duration split. It's a visual to give an indication of how much of the time we're going to a particular receiving environment. You can see there that those options where we're discharging to 2 environments at the same time are hatched. So for option, if we're moving across the page, so on the left-hand side, we've got the ocean discharge. The option next to it, which is option 10, I think, going backwards, is showing that 50% of the time we're split between land and ocean. So I won't dwell on this, but it's hopefully helpful in terms of helping to explain where wastewater is ending up and which receiving environment for each of the alternatives. That's probably all I probably want to say there, Milena, so probably back with you.
Thanks, Robert. Right, so the final phase. Now, the documents that you've received have used a consistent scoring process, and they've all involved our technical experts or our iwi partners through the process to be prepared. Generally, it's a 1 is a low score, so low alignment, 5 being a high score, high alignment. And then out of that, when we've collectively pulled together the scores for each of the criteria that's within an assessment, 1 is the best and 11 is worst, and this will make sense when I move on to slides later on. Now, we have applied a technical weighting for what we believe represents the more important or maybe, yeah, probably in alignment with where we think the council's values, or from a technical perspective, I should say, where we believe the weightings should sit. However, the weightings could be changed. So we've also looked at, for sensitivity analysis, some alternatives, and we have the ability to work through alternative weightings with you later on today if you would like to do that. So following the assessments, we pull it into the BPO assessment, which we will talk about later on. So in terms of actual processes and getting to the point of a BPO recommendation, we undertook the scoring within each of the assessment. We've applied a technical weighting, which was undertaken by the project team, and it's involved the project chair and chief engineer. We then had collection of the assessment outcomes, and they've all been consolidated into a spreadsheet. We then looked at a ranking with the scenarios applied, just to see where options sat, and there's some quite consistent options that fell down the bottom of the ranking, and there's some that have come up on top. And there's also a consistent mid-range. So after that, we then took all of the options through the BPO criteria, where we only did a scoring exercise. There is no weighting, and there was legal advice too to not weight, because we couldn't determine or predetermine that anything was more important within condition 23B, which is the BPO criteria. So 1 being low and 5 being high alignment. And then out of that, we've then got the BPO recommendation. But we would like to consider wider issues in terms of iwi and also some stakeholder input. So moving on to the rankings out of the assessment, we had the multi-criteria analysis, which, I'm sorry, I've just got a child playing in the background. Amara, can you please go out? My mum's presenting. Go. So the multi-criteria analysis, we took the 5 most represented scenarios from that and incorporated that into an overall. We then had the Māori assessment, values assessment, or MCA, which had 2 separate assessments. We had a values assessment from Rangitāne, who are mana whenua, and we had a majority of the hapu out of Ngāti Raukawa provide their assessment, and we have consolidated that scoring together in order to come up with a collective ranking. There is a very solid alignment in terms of preference for options and opposition to certain options. For the stakeholder, there was a methodology applied to bring both phases of engagement together and provide a score and then overall ranking. The objectives were set by council. A workshop was held where we assessed the options against the project objectives and then subsequently reviewed. The planning assessment has been undertaken by our technical advisor, Paula Hunter, and peer reviewed by our legal team. The Eco-City strategy was undertaken by our environmental and also our technical leads, and comparative cost is really focusing on our most up-to-date costs only. So there's no sort of alternative kind of working in those scores. So what we've done at this phase is we haven't excluded anything, but you can see where there are particular options that have done well consistently across all of the scoring and which haven't. But we have most options end up with a 10 and 11 with the exception of the 2 to the river. So what we're doing at this point is we're not excluding anything, but I just would take hold of where options that have not done well, you've kind of got to get into the detail to understand why. There's an overall ranking there where we're seeing that the ocean and the river option are coming out first and second. we've got the 43% to the river inland coming third, and we've got the highest treatment with the portion to land coming in fourth, and then fifth equal is the other 55% to river and land, and then a coastal. So we've still got water-based discharges in the top ranking, and we've got the large areas of land that have fallen down to the lower half, and that is overall. So just moving on to the next slide. So why would we apply a weighting? We think that there are a number of assessments that are very robust, and our technical recommendation is based on the project objectives has scored high because council has adopted these from the beginning, and it's been applied consistently throughout the project, where we've had criteria developed through the MCA or traffic light, and also assessments subsequent to those, which is documentation way back a couple of years ago, but I mean, it's all there. So the other thing is recognising the partnership between council and Rangatane and our commitment to the Treaty of Waitangi, ensuring that the RMA matters are considered, and these are key because it is a Resource Management Act process that we are stepping through. So we feel that, you know, in order to find the most streamlined or ultimately the least impact on the environment, which is the purpose of the Act, this should be considered with with a reasonable level of weighting. The community and stakeholder outcomes we see as quite variable. So while everything is documented there, it's quite challenging to hand on heart say that the process last year and then this year is very representative of the groups within the community, but also outside of the community where the impact is happening. So it's useful, but because of that variability, we wouldn't weight that really high. And the other thing is the cost and eco-city strategy are somewhat narrow. We know cost can be an issue, but then in some cases from others, it's not a focus of the outcome. And also the eco-city strategy is very narrow in terms of it being Palmy-centric, which is good for the decision making, but it's also not necessarily capturing outside of our region. So really important too. I mean, we've done a significant piece of work in the eco-city around the carbon and the impact of carbon and the reduction of 30%, which is a key goal. But then, you know, there's a lot more to be looking at. So the little diagram up there in the corner is just a visual to look at. It's representative of the portions of our technical weighting that we're applying. So in reflection of what I've just outlined with our technical recommendation, we have considered the project objectives as the highest with 25%, with the RMA planning and the Māori values at 20%, and the remaining with 15 to the multi-criteria analysis, 5 and 5 and 10. There are alternatives that we've considered, and that is in the documentation you've looked at. We've focused on stakeholder, Māori values and cost. And in the next slide, when I get onto that, oh, actually it might be an alternative in the document. You can see how higher value you need to place on specific criteria in order to make significant change to the outcome. But what we've got here is we've applied reasoning where Māori values to enforce the partnership more significantly, so 50%. For stakeholder, we've pushed it up to 35%, but still giving that reflection of, well, you know, how because of that variability, how are we going to apply it at 50%? I don't think that would be, we didn't feel that could be appropriate. And with cost being such a significant issue for the council, we have applied 40% as an alternative. So as I mentioned, we can adjust these later on. We have the spreadsheet, and Pete can help step through that if you want to see the workings. So the impact of the weighting scenarios. Now this is in the documentation, and this shows the outcome. So this is the rankings of each of the different scenarios that I've just talked about. Our technical recommendation shows that ocean, river, the two high treatment river options are coming through with this, also the 53-43, which is the inland split between river. And consistently across all of the different scenarios, we're getting the coastal land areas, which are very significant. We're talking, 3,000 plus hectares of land, coastal land, are coming in low, and the Jewel River is also coming in low. So so overall, despite adjusting the focus of weighting, it shows that the options are relatively consistent from the highest to lowest ranked. So the next step in the process is to look at the BPO test criteria. So condition 23B includes identifying the receiving sensitivity, the environment, the potential adverse effects on the broad scope of environment, which means the natural, so the physical, the social, economic and cultural environments, comparative financial impacts, technological knowledge, so that may include operational risk, risk of exceedances, so how reliant can we be on the operation to not comply. So if there's a poor performance issue or something that's quite a risky type of technology, is there the potential there for it to not meet the targets that were required as a condition of consent or the current standards. And the BPO assessment process that we've undertaken has involved all of our technical team, our legal advisors, and Rangatani, our chairperson, and the chief engineer. This is just for reference, so you'll see this in the documentation. We've applied this, again, the score of 1 to 5, as I mentioned, so 1 being low and 5 being high, and it's a comparative type of assessment. So each of those criteria I mentioned on the previous slide are actually broken down into more detail, and then the options are assessed against those specifically. So, and again, they're not weighted. These are the scores, and then so on the left-hand side, next to the option description, you've got the rank of the assessments out of the different arms that I've talked about previously. So that's based on our technical recommendation. It's not incorporating the other scenarios. So what you can see is you can compare where the options came overall out of our assessments against how they are scoring against the different criteria. So while I've got the summary of the criteria here, which is 6, that is encompassing the breakdown of the of each of the definitions, which I showed on the previous slide. So what I've done is highlight here the options that have come through without a 1. So a 1 we would consider as being potentially very difficult or a flaw in terms of being consented, very high risk. And that means, so option 1, all to the river, is not coming through. We've got the 97% to land coming through in a couple of occasions. So in terms of technical knowledge, the scale of the project operationally at that scale is not tried and tested in the country. It would be 3-4 times larger than anything that's happening here. And then the coastal land is actually more significant. So options 8 and 9, the land areas of that are huge and almost on par with the 97% options. And we've also got the ocean and land option that's come through, so from a cost basis. So what has come through is the highest treatment with a small portion to land, option 6 and 7, which is the 53 or 43% inland soils, and the 100% or 97% to the ocean. But we feel that it is important that wider considerations are brought into the overall recommendation. So on the basis that we've got our iwi partners, Rangitane, and then the hapu of Ngāti Raukawa, which a majority of the hapu and are along the river and out to the coast. Ocean is opposed by all iwi, and the discharge to the river all the time is opposed. But the highest treatment level is proposed no matter which environment it ends up going into. They want to see greater reuse of the treated wastewater as a resource. Land-based discharge is supported, but at the same time, the significant land areas have a potential impact, so that needs to be taken into consideration. If there's a way to mitigate the amount of land that's used for discharge, it should be explored. And adaptive management has been identified as a potential way to try and stage, but also consider how there is a reduction in the amount that goes to the river. But all in all, it needs to be the highest treatment level. So with that, identifying options 2, 6 and 7 because of the highest treatment or the land areas where we can explore discharge with reuse to wetlands or other alternatives that's described in the documents are more aligned, and options 1, 10 and 11 are strongly opposed. To move forward with iwi as partners in this, I believe that there needs to be further development of the option once it is adopted, if iwi consider the option acceptable, and council do as well. There are a number of other considerations from stakeholders in the community, and this is by all means not the list that has come out of the engagement process, and you can see that in the documentation you've been provided, but there are a number of things that have come out that are quite strong and consistent messages for council to consider. And I will, ring fence that by saying that no one option is considered preferred across all sectors. It doesn't matter where we go, we are impacting on a sector or a community. But options have, and the preferences have shifted over time, and I think that has come from further information being available. The majority recognise that the best treatment is needed. Again, affordability needs to be balanced out with what is the best treatment or the best solution. It's got to be sustainable and provide for growth, and the environment is key. So just moving on lastly to the technical recommendation for council to consider. If we are to incorporate the values and recommendations by Rangitane and our neighbouring iwi, we would exclude option 11, even though it has come out in the BPO assessment and also the previous assessments as one of the preferred. And you can do that if you go back to the original scoring. If you were to consider options that were ranked the worst, you would have a basis for not including a number of options, and that would be one of them. However, there's a desire there to increase the land area. So we've got options 2, 6 and 7 that have come out through the BPO test and have also come through from the assessments as being potential BPO solutions. So the highest treatment level 4, which is option 2, we would consider as a viable BPO solution, and a staged approach to increasing the portion of discharge to land or through reuse in an adaptive management approach. So that is all from myself. Robert, do you have anything further you'd like to add? Or David?
No, I think I'm happy to hand it back to the Mayor and to take questions.
Okay.
Fine, nothing from me.
Thank you, Milena. Thank you, David. Thank you, Robert. That's a good summary on what has been basically 3 years of work. So and basically an hour. So thank you for that. Look, we have a number of questions. I think we've got 3 of them. We'll do those first, and then we'll just see where we lie, and we possibly might break after that. But I have Councillor Butt first.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Milena and Robert and David. Just a small question. In almost all the reports we have been receiving and discussing before the final agenda papers and this presentation, this option on the top says 77% to the river. All other papers say 75%. It's a change of 2% in the last 2 days. Is there a reason, or is there a technical point behind it?
No, that'll simply be around some finessing of precise periods. So It's not at this stage. It's not a hugely material, no. So that's not a deliberate mistake. This is a duration-focused statistic, so 77%. The 75% may have referred to the portion of flow going to land below low flow. That may be the confusion. So when we below half median, we send 3/4 of the flow to land and 25% carries on being discharged to the river. So that may be where you're getting confused. So that was the reference to 75%. So that's during the period of low flow.
All right. Thank you. Councillor Harpiter.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, David and Milena and Robert. Just a question around page 20 of the document, which talks about the land. I just wanted to ask the coastal versus the inland and the quality of the land. In terms of coastal versus inland, if you're looking at either option, which is option 6 versus option 7, the soil types of both different options, if we were looking at option 6 versus 7, the quality type of soil is different on both types. So could you just, I know it's I don't want a long answer, just a short answer. We've had a number of people talk to us about soil types, and particularly outside of this, and going with option 6 or option 7 is it's different, particularly with coastal. And I just want to just have a quick answer on that.
So option 6 and 7 are both to inland sites, so there's no fundamental difference in terms of those soil types. But I think you mean options 8 and 9, do you? They're the coastal soils.
So you're not going to coastal at all?
None of the 3 options that are in the final slide, no, relate to coastal.
Okay, going back to option 6 and 7, are we going to identify, because the picture on page 20 is quite a large spot of land, are we going to identify down at any stage, I know we're going through an RMA process, where that is in the Manawatu, in the Palmerston North area, or does that go through a longer process? Because we've got people that are quite worried about what part of the city area that will be.
At this stage, for the purposes of developing the material around the options, we have indicatively identified a number of areas to assess, the likely soil types and the likely footprints, but we have not selected specific areas of land yet. That would be a process that would occur following confirmation of the BPO. We would begin that field work and engagement with potential landowners. So we have indicative areas identified, which indicate that there are areas of soils potentially which would be suitable, but we have not confirmed or selected any of those for a full option.
Thank you, Robert.
All right, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. My question's just about the relatively low ranking that's been given to the that's been given to the community and stakeholder feedback at only 5%. So David, in his introduction, said that there had been a huge amount of community engagement, discussion, and feedback, but whether or not it has a tangible effect on the outcome, I think the community is going to feel a bit disregarded to see their views only weighted at 5%, and I'm not sure how we can really justify that. I'm just interested to hear why it is that those views, of which I understand, there were probably at least thousands of bits of community feedback. Why are they considered to be so unreliable that we can only weight them at 5%?
Perhaps I could make the first answer for that through you, Mr. Chair. The 5% was allocated by us because the stakeholder and community feedback was so variable. So irrespective of what weighting you put on it, you had a very variable outcome because every other portion of the community had a preference that was different. We have shown you in the options analysis that you can, and the council may wish to change the weighting and ask for it to be higher, and we've given you a very high stakeholder weighting option that you can look at as well. The reality is that whichever weighting you use, the outcome doesn't change substantially because the feedback's so variable. Not that it isn't important, it's just that which sector of the community are you going to listen to, because they're all so different. That's the challenge at this stage. So it was feeding that into the overall assessment. But fully appreciate the comment. We don't want the community to think their position isn't important. It was listened to. It's just that when you assess it with everything else, they're very variable. But we've given you the high option as well to consider.
Okay, Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I just want to go to option 2 really and just tease a few things out on that. Is it our intention to for that 760 hectares to be within the Palmerston North City boundary?
Yes. So we would. It's a mitigation from an iwi perspective. So with Rangatane, throughout the process, they've always said, if you can bring the land that you need to do the land-based discharge, whichever option, it needs to be as close to Palmerston North and within it, the rohi, as a mitigating factor on other iwi. Now, realistically, with the land areas, they are significant, and we would need to still explore with that smaller area on option 2. It's around 700 to 800 hectares, an area of land that it may end up being slightly into another area. But if we can try and bring it into our jurisdiction as much as possible, that is the preference. But as Robert said, we still need to go through a site identification process.
So at this stage, are there any concerns about landmass limitations around sort of perhaps expansion of population or a regionalisation requirement later on?
Growth assumptions have been incorporated into all of the options, and what we've identified and when we've done the assessments is that if we had unprecedented growth or it was to take on a regional one, land-based irrigation, we believe it is a higher constraint than if we were discharging to an ocean or had an ability to upgrade the treatment process and discharge to a water body. So if we were to explore regionalising and had a land-based discharge that had already acquired significant land areas, for example 97%, you're looking at 3,000 and then you're looking at 4,000 hectares of land. So we've got a continuous expansion of land base. So I would see that as being a risk for any option that's considering a land-based discharge. Robert or Dan?
Okay, and sorry, can I just have what?
I think your comment is that with respect to growth within Palmerston North, would the land area for waste treatment be problematic for the development growth of the city? And I think that would be done on the next stages when we take into account the consenting process, the future growth of the city and the appropriateness of the land area to be selected. As Robert said, at this stage, the work has primarily been done on soil type and analysis as the criteria, taking into account the points Milena made regarding the relative iwi group's preferences about geographic location.
Okay, just to finish off, Mr. Mayor, if I could. So just in respect of iwi views, Mana Whenua actually said discharge to land outside Palmerston boundary is not supported. And Hapu of Ngāti Raukawa have said that the discharge to land within Palmerston North City boundary is stipulated. So with that, I guess, in terms of options other than option 2, where the treatment levels were specified at lower levels, were iwi and Māori interests, were they ever higher treatment levels against the various options, for example, the ocean option?
That was that has come through as some of their recommended. So in terms of ocean, no, it doesn't matter what level of treatment. And to be honest, they even in the presentation that came to Project Steering Group, Rangitane representatives said that 100% to the river, but despite being the highest treatment level, still wasn't supported. So they did want to see a higher treatment level to land, but still didn't support the excessive land areas, the 97%, because it had such an impact. It would have to go into neighbouring iwi areas. So if the question is, can we apply higher treatment, it was discussed with iwi to land, but the principle behind acquiring that much land and discharging it for just wastewater without having some type of reuse incorporated into the solution, or having highest treatment, were issues. Does that kind of answer?
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. Okay, thank you. Sorry, can I just get one other piece of clarification? Option 2, can you confirm to me that on the information that we've been provided, there will always be some discharge at various levels to the river?
If I can answer that, Councillor. Essentially, the options have been developed to effectively mitigate any effect on the receiving environment. So what we established through our modelling was that at the chosen high level of treatment, provided we removed at least 75% of the flow to the river during low flow periods, we were confident we could meet the in-river water quality requirements. That does not mean we cannot remove more from the river. If we wish to remove 100% of the discharge below half median, we would of course require more land or more beneficial reuse. One of the requirements, really one of the challenges for this option, if it were to go forward, would be to explore how we could meet more effectively the aspirations to take the flow out of the river all the time. I think the thing to bear in mind also is these options are all provided for 35 years of consented growth. So, which is essentially another 35 to 40% additional flow and load from where we sit at the moment. So, the footprint of 700 odd hectares would be sufficient, most probably, to allow us to take all of the flow out of the river during low flow for current flows and loads. The question would be, what do we do as we go forward? So that would be the challenge as we accommodate future growth. So no, the option is based around what's required to meet the environmental effect standards. We can always do better. So that applies to all of the treatment standards selected for all of the options as well. You can always, there are options to do better in some of those, many of those alternatives. So.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. You've answered the question, I guess, but the reality is that there will still be some flow under option 2. That's what the answer I wanted. Thank you.
All right, Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks to the team for taking us through the presentation and all the work to get here. Most of the questions that I wanted to ask are around understanding really what we're saying in terms of the B option that's identified, and to clarify a few things in there. So to start with, can I get an answer to what we mean when we say adaptive management? What is adaptive management and what isn't adaptive management?
I'm going to ask Jim Bradley to jump on that one, and then perhaps some legal interpretation as well, if that's possible. Oscar.
Yes, thank you, Councillor, for the question. Morning all, Mr Mayor, councillors. Adaptive management is a technique that is becoming more commonly used under the RMA, where over time and through monitoring and through policies and plans, changes are made that adapt to changing requirements, be they improved environmental standards, be it a policy to change over time into, in this case, more land, be it a situation of upgrading even further the treatment. And often trigger levels are put in consents that will trigger when these adaptations, these changes go over time. So in terms of the technical recommendation, the starting point is, of course, that treatment level 4, the highest treatment level we have, and then measuring over time the amount going to land, the growth pattern, and changing the arrangement is in terms of the consent conditions put up. Maybe now the legal addition to that practical kind of solution.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Probably not much I can add to that. That's a pretty good summary. And I think that the key points were hit on there by Jim. And I suppose one key thing from a consenting perspective, if you're going to include adaptive management as a consent condition or something that you're going to commit in terms of reducing the potential environmental impacts, is that you have to have some very firm parameters around that, and it needs to be clear to the consent authority, be that Horizons or the Environment Court, that there is a clear adaptive management process and plan that is going to, I think Jim mentioned sort of trigger points, that is going to react to improvements in technical and scientific knowledge, as well as reacting to the environmental effects going forward. So you can't just put a broad-based adaptive management plan in there. It needs to be quite clear in terms of what you're going to be looking for in terms of environmental effects and responses to those effects.
Mr. Chair, if I can just come in, Brett, I think the key issue here is that we're kind of giving a snapshot of, as Robert said, a system that would be functional in accommodating 35 years of growth. So the adaptive management program is really saying, over the period of time, how do we get the most appropriate system as the city grows? And as Jim said, as technology becomes cheaper, some of the microfiltration stuff that we're proposing now would have been impossible 5-10 years ago because of the state of technology. So the adaptive management program is actually saying we're being rational about this so that the city consciously knows that it's going to meet best practice for the appropriate growth and the environmental conditions required as we move forward, given 35 years is a relatively long time to be thinking about.
Thanks, all. So just to clarify then, adaptive management includes the quote unquote going up the pipe. So things that are actually managing the inflow and infiltration better, things that are reducing the demand at source, like grey water, etc.
Absolutely. The first rule of waste treatment is to reduce the source. So it's a case of going back, and I think the city itself will be wanting to do that because that has significant benefits, because you're reducing your water demand, you're reducing your resource cost. So that's definitely a requirement, and it's also a requirement to be thinking about, and Robert mentioned it earlier, the reuse components within the system in terms of the whole notion of energy, materials and so on that also becomes more adaptive as we get more knowledge into the system and economics change and more things become viable.
Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. So the second aspect then around this that I'd like to clarify is what we mean when we talk about a combination of options 2, 6, and 7, because in the slides we start to see reference to combination, but then we also see some reference to staging there. So can we just understand what we mean by combination and how that would play out?
Robert may want to get into this in more detail, but the reality of what we're saying is that to take it through to consent now, we're suggesting to council that this cluster of options allows us to now sit down and optimise what the city would need over time to meet the environmental requirements, the social cultural requirements and the fiscal requirements in terms of treatment level and land application within the confines of those broad options. There is not a singly defined position right now, Brent, because we're saying it's a mix and match of those, more land area, the less river, and how do we then mitigate changes in climate. Less rain, more rain will change the land mix applications and so on. So the next stage in the work is really to pick these 3 options up as a cluster and sit down and say, what is the best consentable mix to actually give the city a roadmap into the future that is appropriate now, but still gives them options into the future to go to build a resilient and reliable system, which you'll recall is one of the objectives within our original format.
Yeah, myself, I think what the team has suggested in terms of this recommendation is that in terms of a consenting pathway, option 2 with the highest level of treatment with some examination of the proportion of wastewater that could be removed from the river, so be that 100% out of the river below half median flow, becomes a starting point. But over the duration of the consent, there would be an examination of options to increase the proportion of the wastewater that would, or the period for which wastewater was removed from the river. So essentially, starting point in terms of that removal, the aspiration is to find an option that over time, and that may be over 10 or 20 years, progressively increases the proportion of wastewater removed. Now, the work we've done to date is very indicative and is conservative around the levels of wastewater that can be applied to land, and we may find that we can apply more wastewater to land during the drier periods of the year, and therefore we can achieve greater removal. And that's been experienced in some other jurisdictions. But I think there's a consentable option in option 2, with some refinement to achieve greater levels of support from stakeholders. But then there would be a commitment to move towards option 7, in terms of a higher proportion out of the river. So I think that's what's meant by combination. So
thanks,
Brent, in terms of procurement. Building the treatment system is probably something we can do quicker than procuring the land and getting the appropriate systems in place. So it's also a timing effect for implementation that needs to be taken into account on the consenting process.
Thanks. I guess to clarify, I'm really trying to understand, will we be committing to achieving level 6 at some point during the life of the BPO? Or is that something that we're wanting to hold off or proposing to hold off as an aspiration, but not a commitment?
At this stage, we're saying that that's included in what we would be looking at in terms of the options for the recommendation for the BPO for consenting. That would come back to council as to whether it's that number, whether it's bigger or smaller, that comes through in the process as we work through it now to do the refinement. what we're saying is that that's the mix and match that we would look at to refine now in terms of detail. All the council's doing now is saying this mix is the best BPO. Now let's see how we come up with a single system that would be consentable with these parameters as the guidelines.
Right. Thank you for that. I've just signaled that I probably do have some reservations around that I might reflect through as we get further into the meeting. Finally, if I might ask, around the map that's represented on page 19, I believe it is, of the supporting information pack. If we think about staging this over time, will there be revisiting of where that purple blob is? How fixed is that position on that map?
I think, Brett, at this stage, we're really saying that the work done to date has really been based on soil type, considering the cultural preferences and where points that would likely meet. But could it move? Yes. There's no defined boundaries and exact spaces. We're just saying indicatively that's the sort of space and area that you would be wanting to place it in, as opposed to sticking it out at the coast or somewhere else on a different soil type. And obviously, the closer you can get it to Palmerston, the lower the costs in terms of transfer.
Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Look, I'll do one more question, and then I'll Councillor Dingwall next, and then I've got the Deputy Mayor, Councillor Naylor, Councillor Dennison and Councillor Beattie. We'll do you after a break, but Councillor Dingwall, to you for the last question before a break.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So there was a lot of comments there saying that we have involved iwi in each of the assessments. And I'm just wanting to get a little bit more elaboration on what exactly that means and how many experts in each of the other assessments were actually tangata whenua.
Hi, Elena here. So we have Rangatane mana whenua, as you'll understand and appreciate. We have Ngāti Apa Mopoku, who have been working with Rangitane, and they have been brought along the journey with Rangatane providing that leadership. Ngāti Raukawa are made and have the runanga, but they also have a number of hapu. I think it's between 12 hapu. A representative of one of the hapu was mandated to represent the iwi, and they have undertaken their own independent assessment of all the technical information. So that iwi is large, and it extends from Rangitane out to the coast. So basically the iwi that would be impacted by the options if we were to consider a land-based solution or out to the ocean specifically, right? So they engaged consultants to review all of our technical work and provided a summary of where they positioned prior to then undertaking their own MCA, which you've got the Māori Values Assessment Report, and you've got both of their documents there. So there's Rangitane's Māori Values, but then there's also the MCA from Ngāti Raukawa. So they've been brought along, all of those iwi that I've just mentioned have been brought along in varying capacities. And we've had Rangitane do all of the cultural values work for the traffic lighting, for a number of the technical documents, the wetlands assessment or options assessment. They've written the Māori values for the MCA that you attended, and then they've subsequently done this cultural values work as well, incorporated into the final assessment process.
Okay, so, but in terms of the actual assessment side of things, was that, so they were doing the traffic light system, but how much of that input is, I guess, tangata whenua, or are we saying that tangata whenua's input is the Māori section that we've, Māori values and MCA section that was separated out of the 20%, and the other 80% comes not Māori?
Okay, so rangatane values are incorporated into the eco-city strategy, and there's also, and so we take guidance as mana whenua for this project because they have governance over the wastewater project in the council in this area. So we need to consider them up front, and that is why they've been incorporated into the whole process from governance through to all of the technical work that's been ongoing for the last 2 years. For the current assessments that have been undertaken, Rangatane's environmental officer has peer reviewed the RMA assessment because under Part 2 of the Act, we've got a significant portion in there that requires an application or a consent to enact or bring out the tangata whenua values and also Treaty of Waitangi, so is what I was trying to say. We have the Eco-City strategy, which has specific criteria around mana whenua rangatane's values with the river and association. So that has been assessed in terms of those impacts, and that has been shared with the environmental person with rangatane. And then with the BPO assessment, the impact on the sensitivity of the environment, we had social, cultural, economic, and the natural environment. So the cultural scores were defined by mana whenua, so rangatane again. What other reports have they looked at? The objectives, we've shared that. Yep, I think that's it. So
okay. So I guess my final question then would be, in terms of the technical recommendation, if we ended up weighting Māori values at 50%, would that have an impact on the technical recommendations at the end, the summary at the end of the whole report? Because you said that changing them mostly wouldn't make much of a difference, but when you have a look at the ones for Māori, you know, they did list option 4 as number 1 in the ranking, but that's not listed in the technical recommendations in the final summary.
Yeah, I might ask Pete just to clarify how the scores come about, because it's quite important to understand how they've been captured and then how the technical weighting or the other scenarios of weightings actually applies, because it sort of captures you out where you think, if option 4 was the highest ranked, why has it not come through if you're going to weight Māori at 50% preference and it's not showing through? I think that's where you're getting at, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Pete, would you mind just giving a quick rundown?
Well, through you, Mr. Mayor, while Pete's bringing the spreadsheet up, I think the two things that we need to remember, Councillor, is first of all, the recommendation has taken the iwi considerations in significantly more than just the spreadsheets, which you'll have picked up in the presentation, that, for example, the ocean was eliminated on an iwi position, not on a technical position. So we've actually reviewed that separately in terms of the wider considerations that Milena went through. In terms of the larger land areas and the coastal land areas, it was the iwi's position that the coastal areas were not their preference. And there was also recognition from them that while their preference was for land area in the meetings that we had with them, that they were cognizant of the fact that the size of the land areas was a challenge. So we've tried to take that into account as well, so that when you take the mix in the BPO process, the risk components in terms of the scale of all land, while it may be desirable from some standpoints, created a huge operational risk. And so that's why we balanced that out in terms of the overall mitigations to get a sustainable solution that met their requirements, but that was also reliably deliverable from a practical point of view. Back to you, Pete.
I think when we were, yeah, thank you. I think Milena showed the slide that related to the summary of the ranks, where the EV option 4 is ranked top in terms of the ranks. But when we consider the overall rating and the weightings that are applied, when we consider an individual option, it's a combination of part of the MCA by the weight, plus the Maori by the weight, plus the stakeholder by the weight, plus the other 4 by the weight. And to some extent, once you apply the weight, irrespective of what the weight is, sometimes they end up balancing out. And in terms of the comparison of the ranks by weighting, option 4 does come out top in terms of the ranks, but it tends to get excluded from the further assessment as a result of the BPO due to the large land areas that are involved and the difficulties in trying to manage a system that's at almost 4,000 hectares, which is probably about 10 times bigger than what we have in New Zealand at the moment.
Yes. So I fully understand all of that. I guess my question is, looking at that, if Māori values were listed as 50%, and then the other ones were worked out, however the other ones were worked out, would the technical recommendations still be 2, 6, and 7? Just trying to see. It's quite hard.
Well, the technical recommendation will always be the same because that's based on the weights that's been defined by the technical working group. If there is a separate assessment that's based on providing an emphasis to Maori values, the recommendation would never carry forward option 4, I don't think, because it's precluded from further consideration due to the scores that's evident in the BPO assessment. So it scores 1s in terms of a recommendation being carried forward. These are considered to be fundamentally flawed.
Okay.
So option 1 would get removed. So we end up in effect hiding the rows that are based on 1s.
So would it get removed the way that ocean got removed because of the Maori values portion? Is that what you're saying there?
Well, the ocean got removed due to the fact that Maori were totally opposed to ocean.
Yeah, and so would it?
Whereas the option 4 is being removed due to concerns associated with issues related to impacts on the environment and technical knowledge.
Okay, cool. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, people. Right, I've still got 5 here with Councillor Barrett added in with more questions. We will break. If I could suggest that you just turn your mics off, leave your screens on, so we don't have this whole mash of people trying to get back on again. We'll come back and we'll adjourn. We'll come back at 11 o'clock. So go and stretch your legs, grab a drink or coffee or something to eat, and we'll see you back at 11. Thank you. Kia ora everyone and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that short break. I'll now go back to our questions, and we still have a number of them. Over to you, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is probably similar to Councillor Johnson's earlier question around weightings for community. This is, I guess, more around the suggested weighting for the eco-city strategy at 5%. So David, with your opening comments, you said that this project was driven by the council's vision, and obviously the vision is broken into several goals, and one of those goals is our eco-city strategy. And so I was just interested to understand how that still only was given a weighting of 5%. So I'm interested more in the process to determine that piece rather than the influence that may or may not have.
The reason we really allocated that was we tried to assess what the real impacts were in terms of the mix and match. We changed that, and the reason why we got Peter here with the spreadsheet was to allow councillors to decide if they wanted to change those weightings, they could, and then see how it might influence the process. So it was really an impact that we thought that it had. The eco-city strategy had influenced basically everything else that we've done. So there's also the issue of double influencing it, if you see what I'm saying. So it guided some of the decisions that we made, which are embedded in the technical criteria and so on. The project objectives take that into account. So you give it 25% for project objectives and then put eco-city on top of that, you get a double effect. We were trying to avoid those sorts of things coming through as well.
Have we not reached that outcome by the weighting given to the RMA process though? Because all of the options are consentable. We've given consideration to adverse effects through environmental outcomes, to tangata whenua, you know, in terms of core drivers of the RMA, but we've still singled out RMA and had quite a big weighting to that. That seems to be the same outcome as what your answer was to the eco-city question.
The reason we gave the RMA a high rating was that it was just a statutory process that was a kind of a go, no-go in terms of the process. If we didn't meet that, everything else wouldn't matter. So that's why we put the weighting on that we did.
But aren't all outcomes already deemed consentable and so therefore would already have been through a mechanism to address RMA concerns?
Yeah, everything that all the options we believe would be consentable in terms of their technical delivery. What we're saying is that some of them would be easier to consent than others because of the risk factors, which comes in particularly under the BPO process at the end. There are different risk components in terms of actually getting the RMA consent. Some will be harder to get than others. So, for example, to take the most extreme example, the ocean discharge is technically RMA consentable, but there is a risk there because we know that iwi will object to it, and although it's not under the RMA, under the MACA, the Marine and Coastal Act, they could probably veto it. So we've got those are the other risks that we're talking about.
Okay. All right, thank you. The weighting given to Māori views, acknowledging that both mana whenua and the iwi that we engaged with had very similar responses, but can you explain why we didn't separate mana whenua and give a higher weighting to their perspective specifically? So ignore the fact it was they had similar views to Raukawa and others. I'm just understanding why mana whenua weren't given a higher weighting for us.
Yeah, I'll speak to that one. So mana whenua have governance position, and they also have been involved through the various assessments from day one, at the traffic light phasing, and then wrote the cultural values. So a majority of the cultural values through our entire process, or all of it, has been from mana whenua perspective. And they have provided that feedback and input into the BPO assessment under the impacts of cultural values, and they have also had their values represented in the MCA, and then they've also overseen, for example, through the EcoCity strategy, there's a very clear linkage of mana whenua to the Manawatu River. So I believe that they mana whenua are represented across a range of assessments in the BPO assessment and through the options assessments quite strongly. We didn't consider under that values assessment to weight them higher because of the extent of their involvement in the project, and originally actually mana whenua weren't going to do the values assessment in that arm of all of the assessments. It's just come in because they felt that with further information and after the MCA, they wanted to provide very clear direction to council on where their values sat, and then that could be used as a benchmark for the next phase of the project. So depending on which option we go with, these values can then be developed and incorporated into the final solution that goes for resource consent.
Okay, so their values are woven through rather than being a single consultation arm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. The comments around particularly community stakeholder views, taking affordability into consideration. Apologies if I've missed it, but have we defined what affordability means?
I don't think I've seen a definition that says above or below a given number is affordable. What we've really just looked at from a costings point of view, and from a cost standpoint, we've just looked at the range of costs and where the different projects sat. So that's where that assessment went. From the community's point of view, I guess people commented on affordability, which I suspect varied depending on the stakeholder group and their individual views. I don't know that the council, we certainly as a group didn't decide what the city deemed affordable and what they deemed wasn't affordable as a guideline. Robert and Elena might like to add to that.
Nothing really to add. I suppose only that the cost assessment ranking of 1 to 5 sought to group options, score them indicatively. So those options that had the highest scores did get the score of 1. On that basis, we considered those to be much less affordable and therefore undesirable to proceed. But no, there's no absolute benchmark.
Okay. The final slide, the technical recommendation slide, and this is partially been teased out by Councillor Barrett, but I haven't heard proper some firm clarification. It says around obviously the technical recommendation is to adopt option 2 in a staged approach to increase the portion of discharge of treated wastewater. So I've heard the goal, the desired outcome, to be able to increase the portion of discharge of treated wastewater applied to land over time, but I am not clear. Robert, I think you said option 7 was actually what that goal would be working towards, but where does option 6 fit into that grouping then? Or possibly giving you an out to this question, is this the advice that will come back on the 1st of September? Because I've heard what the goal, the overall ambition is, but I haven't heard what the actual plan advice will be, and it might be a preemptive question, but be interested in some comments on that.
I think what in terms of the technical team's recommendation, our recommendation is an option which delivers the highest level of treatment and sufficient diversion from the river that meets all of the environmental outcomes. So option 2 in its purest form would meet that requirement. But what the team recognised is that that does not meet the aspirations of other stakeholder groups, iwi, and the community in general. So I suppose I'd have to say the technical team doesn't have a particular target for the level at which of diversion from the river. That is essentially a continuum. What we believe though is that council can work with other stakeholders to agree what is what might be an end goal and what might be the stages that council would commit to. But from a consenting point of view, option 2, we believe will deliver that. There is the option at the very beginning to take 100% of the flow out below half median, if council gave effect to the full footprint of land from an early stage in the development. Given, as I said, we've looked at the alternatives, including in excess of 35-40% growth in flows and loads. So I don't think there is a position from the technical team in terms of that diversion. That's really a conversation with other stakeholders in terms of council committing to an option through the process. So option 2, starting point, we understand as an aspiration to move to a higher level of diversion. The question of 43 and 53, remember, those were set around achieving environmental effects triggers, or 43 that's the minimum we believe you need to take out of the river, but that was based on a lower level of treatment. So the moment you deliver a higher level of treatment, you can achieve that with a much smaller diversion from river discharge. So yeah.
So on the slide that says technical recommendation is a staged approach, that seems to contradict then what you're saying now.
No, what we're saying is you start with high level of treatment and a minimum of removing 75% of the low flow out of the river, but that in order to achieve a consentable outcome agreeable to all stakeholders through the consent process, we would work to increasing that percentage diversion. There's no magic number that we come up with for that level of diversion. So
with the staged approach comments, then there's no stages, there's no goal, there's no, I mean, if you divert 1% more, then actually, are you saying that you've ticked that box?
Well, you won't have met aspirations for stakeholders, but in terms of a consentable solution, potentially you could get consent for that alternative. Yeah.
So within the consent, there's not going to be a kind of pathway laid out to say that there's a series, an X amount of stages, that there's this much diversion per stage, or there's not actually going to be a very clear measurable pathway to achieve either option 6 or 7. It's just option 2, and then we'll see if we can get anything else.
No, we're guided by what you want to achieve as council, right? What we're saying is the decision rests with you in terms of how you would want to, what you would want to commit to, and having that clarity, we would then set out what that looks like in terms of a staged approach.
And that would be worked into a consent application. So you would need direction.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. All we're saying, we haven't told you what that should be here. We've said, here's the starting point, and here are the aspirations. We can consent the option from day one, pursuing option 2. But if you want to meet the aspirations of your community and iwi, then yes, we would suggest you need to do more. But the question of how much more really is resting with you. It's not a requirement. It's not a requirement of the to meet the the standards and river standards and at this stage. But there are some challenges around the BPO process. Obviously, that if we can't get support from iwi and our stakeholders, then any application will be challenged through the consent process. So we're trying. There's an opportunity here to achieve or provide for an option that has a high degree of consensus and support, but is also practicable and more affordable. So that's really, I think,
okay. Thank you. That's answered. I've just got one more question.
Add one more point, Alicia, with the Mayor's Chairman's approval. I think remember that in the wider considerations bit that Malaina talked about earlier, the recommendation also said that in the next step going forward, we would be strengthening the integration with iwi, and that's part of where the river only will not be an option, because we know that they don't want that. So that's the point Robert's making as well, that we know that the river land option that we're talking about going forward is a treatment level as if it was river only in terms of the original options, but land to accommodate us going beyond what today might be statutorily consentable, albeit with argument. But by working with iwi and our stakeholders and looking forward, then we will be adding land value, land application over time to get a better outcome and improve our recovery of resources, et cetera, which are all part of the Eco-City and sustainability program that we want to build into it. So this is the starting point for the next stage in the process.
Yeah, and I absolutely accept and acknowledge that. I'm just looking for probably a bit more concrete pathways that are measurable and to track what we're doing. But that's fine. I accept that, and I think that's clear in the report anyway. But yeah. Thank you.
I want to do some boundaries on it, so we can say we're working into this envelope to head in that direction, and you will get those steps in the consented process, because that's what we will have to do at that stage.
Sure. Okay. And then just my final question is one of the comments, I think maybe Robert, you said it was all options provide for 35 years of consented growth. And I just wanted to understand, I guess, based on what modelling, because obviously at the moment we're seeing quite significant growth in the city, but that's not, we're not going to see growth at the same level. But how have we done our modelling on growth, taking into account like the current kind of booms that we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, that's why I referred to us having revised the growth projections within the last few months, and we used the growth projections used in the 10-year plan. So they've significantly increased both the short-term, medium and long-term growth projections, but they are only projections, of course. So yeah.
No, I was just looking more for the source, but the 10-year plan is good. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Mayor. No further questions at this stage.
Thank you. Look, I'll just add in, because I think what the Deputy Mayor was trying to ask, and without trying to corner you, the officers, you mentioned the adaptive management program, which absolutely, in the reply you gave, would allow for this growth, the staged approach where the Deputy Mayor was going. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And as the next stage in the process, the timing, the scale and the detail would start to come through as part of the consenting process, and we would do that in harmony with the council and iwi, and that would be the basis on which we would put the consent forward ultimately to council. In a perfect world, we would have a joint application that we were all agreed on and would minimise the potential objection if we get it right. And that has been done before in other jurisdictions and other areas, and that's what we would be working towards.
So that would include, because land clearly isn't the panacea of everything, and I suppose that's been borne out with some of the technical advice. But it includes technology as well, improvements in technology.
Yes, and that's, I think, the point that I made earlier, Mr. Mayor, was that the technology that we've talked about today would not have been an option probably 5 to 10 years ago because the technology changes. That will also potentially change moving forward. And so while we can't be as specific on the technology bit, the adaptive program will actually take into account technology changes. I'll call them upstream improvements and developments in land application, cropping, recycling, and other options that would fit into the sustainability program and the city's aspirations.
Yeah, because we talk a lot about iwi, and they're very important, but I don't think anybody online has spoken about, or maybe Councillor Harper alluded to it, but about the farming community. And of course, we've seen the front page of stuff and everything else about their concerns about even coming out of the and again going to land for half of this would destroy quite a number of Class 1 and Class 2 soils.
I don't think the intent is to destroy any soils. I think the key issue is that a combination of science, technology, and appropriate cropping, we would potentially change what might be the current productive base into alternate productive base. We can't afford to destroy anything. We've actually got to use the resource more effectively. So I think the reason why we, if you like, black flagged, to use the pun, the 100% land area on day one type of solution was that, in fact, we would have real problems. And a land-only solution is, I think, got technical flaws in it, and from a whole range of views, a farming view and also a waste management and the soil rejuvenation standpoint, what we're recommending is technically practical and will take into account developments over time.
I'll just note Jim Bradley's got his hand up. Jim, did you want to comment? Come in, Jim.
You're on mute, Jim, if you're trying to talk.
Sorry, the points you've made, Mr. Mayor and David, just to elaborate on a real live case history very briefly, right at the moment, myself and Stantec are working for Whangarei District Council in their wastewater for Ruakaka Marsden Point, where very large growth was projected when the suite of consents were got. One of those consents that has strength, and going back to the legal comment earlier, you can't have a wishy-washy thing. One of those consent conditions is a periodic review of growth versus projected growth when the consent was put in, of technology against what was proposed, of when a new consent for a greater land area clicks in, and this has to be periodically reviewed as a condition of consent. And there are many consents, particularly the larger ones around New Zealand, that have such technology, environmental, development type reviews that underpin the adaptive management approach. So that approach is live and well, but it has to have definiteness in the consent conditions that are set at the outset.
Thank you, Jim. All right, we'll go back to my colleagues. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks for all the information so far. Now, someone mentioned earlier that the options have been amended and refined and that there are still meaningful alternatives. Now, looking at page 21 of the presentation and under wider considerations and iwi values and recommendations, it's clear that the option 2 is one of the ones that most aligns to iwi values, but option 1 has been fundamentally opposed. And just those option 1 and 2 obviously are the two that with the water has, you know, the highest treatment. I'm just interested in understanding how much, obviously the difference between those two options is quite significant in terms of the cost. Has there been any consideration of any sort of blend or where the threshold would be, where it sort of tips? So I guess, could there be any option that required less land than the 760 hectares in option 2 that would still meet iwi's aspirations, or other, you know, in general meet other stakeholders' aspirations?
Maybe David, I'll just have a quick go. So option 2 was introduced later on in the process, precisely to respond to the problem we had that even at the best level of treatment, level 4, the residual discharge of phosphorus and nitrogen to the river during low flow had the potential to result in negative effects, and particularly some periphyton growth in the river. So we then assessed what percentage of that low flow discharge needed to be removed in order for us to be more confident that we would not trigger that effect, and that was judged to be 75-25, so 75% out of the river to land, and 25% could continue to be discharged to the river. I mean, that option 2 doesn't really meet the aspirations of either iwi or the wider stakeholders in terms of removal from the river. So it's very much perceived as being undershooting, I think, on those alternatives. So there's certainly a desire to push the proportion of diversion out of the river, you know, up the scale. So I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, Councillor.
That's helpful. I guess, so for the 75-25%, I guess, so the 77, the duration, 77% versus the 23% of the time, is that one changeable at all?
Everything is changeable. So it's for all of these options, we've chosen the particular set of conditions or parameters that meet the most demanding receiving environment conditions. So we can always do better. So the duration 77-23, or it's basically it's everything. Whenever we discharge the river below half median, which is the 37.5 QMX, that's currently our current trigger for removing, doing, alum dosing at the current plant. It's when the river's most sensitive. So that period, which is around about 23% of the year in duration, so a little under a quarter of the time, that's the period when the river's most sensitive. So that's why this option says, we'd need to remove at least 75% of that discharge. We can obviously do better, and I think what we're suggesting is, in order to get stronger support for this option, we would look to move that proportion of diversion upwards. There is the option to remove 100% with implementing more land discharge earlier in the project timeline, and maybe other options for diversion as well, beneficial reuse or so.
Okay, I guess really where I'm coming from with this questioning is trying to hold in tension the huge difference in cost. And I think the Deputy Mayor asked the other question that I had around affordability, and I think the answer was no, that hasn't been defined. So it'll be interesting. I guess I'm quite interested in hearing a little bit more about the weighting and why it's only been given 10%, when actually finding a practicable option, I think, has to be, there's so much in the papers about it being affordable, but if that's not actually defined or, if we can't ascertain what is actually affordable, I had understood that the 350 million in our long-term plan wasn't even fundable. So I'm not sure. It would be good to hear a little bit more of the thinking around how that aspect is being held in tension in the weighting that's been given.
I'll have a go at that, Councillor.
Thank you.
So the first issue is that costing is a critical component of it, and therefore it's in there, the numbers are there, you're aware of them, they're our best estimate. Secondly, obviously those costings are at an early stage, so those numbers are not absolute, these are guideline numbers. Thirdly, I think we are also cognizant of the fact that we didn't want to come up with a solution that was dollar-based as opposed to environment and general resource recovery based. So the reason we didn't give it a higher rating or ranking was that we didn't want the council, or in fact the city, to feel that the outcome was entirely, if you like, money driven as opposed to all of the other criteria that are in the mix. So that was the balance overall. And the final thing I would say is that affordability becomes a complex question as to where the money is coming from, how it's structured, and where the finance is. And we're very much aware that the cost is stage one. Once you pick the solution you really want that meets the aspirations collectively of the council vis-a-vis the city, then we have to sit down and say, how is that going to be A, funded, B, financed, because they're two different things in terms of debt and equity, and where would that money come from, whether it's Crown, whether it's a design and build option. The land costs may well be leased and covered by returns on income. There's a whole bunch of financial mixes that you would work a lot more detail on once you've narrowed it down. You don't want to do all of that work on 11 options. The cost's already quite high. So we're really saying cost is critical. Once you get the outcome you really want from an environment point of view, a sustainability point of view, in the broader sense, growth and etc. recovery, then you can sit down and say, what's the cost of this going to be? And remember that being adaptive, some of that cost will come in over time. It's not all year one costing. And then you look at how you're going to finance and fund it.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Okay, Councillor Dennison. Councillor Dennison, are you there?
Sorry, my internet was just jumping in and out. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First question to Marlena. Did I understand you correctly that you had a spreadsheet, that you had some workings that you could show us the sensitivity of some of the modelling that you've done? Can I just get that confirmed first off? And if so, how significant are the changes of that modelling when you mentioned sensitivity?
Okay, so Pete, who was on earlier, is our spreadsheet guru, but we're able to show you what the impact is if we change some of the weightings. What I've given you is, I think in the main report, which is not part of the slide deck, but it shows the relative ranking, gotta use the right word there, ranking against each of the different scenarios. We have an ability to share that with you, which Pete can do, and we can alter those weightings if you want to go through that, and you can see what the impact is.
I personally would find that interesting, but I'll leave it for others to indicate. I don't want that exercise just for my benefit. But thank you. One was around, when we're looking at best practical options, I'm looking around practical options and understanding that Landcare's classification of a lot of the soil around our inland options is poorly drained. How are we limiting ourselves when we know that the sandier soils are actually better options to discharge to? Can I just understand how practical that option of inland discharge is going to be?
Nice, Robert, to jump. So we've got Daryl Irvine, who's PDP, who is our soil scientist.
Yeah, I can answer that. So there's a couple of things to consider with the soil types. Is that yes, it is the inland soils are considered imperfectly drained or poorly drained in areas, and the coastal soils are better drained. But so that addresses the hydraulic issue. But there's also the nitrogen issue we need to consider in terms of those soils as well. So for the freer draining soils are more likely to leach nitrogen than the more restricted soils. So in terms of those coastal soils, we also had to consider the net nitrogen leaching in that area. So that was more of a limiting factor on those coastal soils. The inland soils, they have a slightly higher land use allocation. So that was why there was similar sort of areas required for those coastal options compared to the inland options. Practically speaking, hydraulically, you'd say, oh, well, you'd better get away with a less area on the coastal soils, but it really is to do with that nitrogen leaching. When we consider the limitations of the soils in that inland area, we have developed a soil moisture model which takes into account the lower draining capacity of those soils. So that is taken into account, and that really does drive those larger land areas for those options. Does that address your question?
Councillor, does that answer?
Yep, thank you. I'll just flag, I'm just bouncing in and out of my connection for some strange reason, but I'll go on. That was helpful. If I do come out, I'll come back on my phone just to give you a practical for my situation. The second one was on the financial modelling and a bit along the lines of Councillor Nate. Just in regard to the assumptions and the when we're talking about the land use assumption. Oh my gosh, I'll have to come back in, Grant.
Okay. All right.
Come back to me. I'll come into my phone.
All right. I'll now. Sorry, we'll come back to that one.
Grant, come back. I'll come up with another device.
If you turn your screen off, perhaps, Vaughan. Okay, we'll come back to Councillor Dennison, but if I could go to Councillor Beattie, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, everybody. I've just got two questions left. Probably this one's for Robert. You've taken into account the growth, and have you factored in any reductions for education or regulation that we may look at in the future?
If you recall, Councillor, we did an exercise in looking at a range of what we would call water and load reduction interventions in the domestic residential wastewater space. So we have included a very modest uptake of some of those interventions, mainly because many of them cannot be made mandatory or would rely on, significant intervention on the part of council, maybe financial incentives. So we've relied on some ongoing reduction in water and wastewater generation just by virtue of the fact that people replace appliances over time. But more importantly, what we have included is the assumption of reasonable best practice in the trade waste management area, so that we have indicated that we would expect industries to be incentivized to do reasonably best practice as is currently known. But yeah, we have continued to allow for growth though in obviously in industrial trade waste as well as domestic. So
okay,
that answers your question. So there's a small reduction provided for, but not huge.
Okay, no, that's fine. And my second question is, in the future with technology, if we are using land for discharge, and what are the requirements to bring that land back to original state if it's no longer required?
I suppose a little bit uncertain. Maybe Milena or Daryl could comment. Yeah.
So if land was, I guess, no longer required for wastewater, and I mean, Daryl can probably jump in with the technical stuff, but we would need to remediate it. So we've identified that it's likely to be an hail site, which means it's contaminated land. So therefore, you've got to come up with a remediation plan for if an alternative use was going to be occurring on the site. Daryl, did you want to add anything?
No, that's pretty much covered it. In terms of the activity of the irrigation itself and the infrastructure, that would have very little impact on the actual land, the ability to use that land in the future. It would be more around management of that hail site would be probably the biggest factor to consider.
Okay,
just to comment. Sorry, Councillor, just to comment there. The potential impact of any wastewater application to land will of course depend on the level of treatment and the level of contaminants that are contained in that wastewater. So if we are going to treat to the level 4 that we're proposing, there are very low levels of contaminants contained in that wastewater, albeit some residual nutrients. So the likelihood of there being significant measurable accumulation of contaminants over time will be significantly reduced from the alternative where we provide a lower level of treatment. So in some ways, the option 2 with diversion to land would give us the most confidence that any perceived negative impact or actual degradation could be relatively easily mitigated or remediated. So
okay, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, if I could go back to Councillor Dennison, he's back online.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate the flexibility there. Now, the second question was similar to Councillor Naylor's along the financial assumptions, and knowing that that there's recognition of some of the areas around the land management income that was predicted around the cropping and even the what was some of the other things that there was going to be, the returns were suggested as maybe being inflated by one of our feedback groups that has said, and that the baleage emission costs. I just want to understand how much work had been done, knowing that these were some of the issues, including even acquiring the price of land being increased. How robust are those figures to even get to the 350 million figure for a starting point, let alone the 550 figure for a land discharge component?
I'll start the question, but Jim, the others may want to come in and follow up with some more detail. But from my point of view, the first thing I would say is that the costings have been reviewed by third parties, both from a treatment point of view, a land acquisition point of view, and the revenue generation by crop. Robert mentioned that there has been changes over time, and we had another whole review of our land application strategy, what crops would be planted, the root depths and all of the technical issues, and the outcome and application of it. So those reviews have all been done, and the current numbers reflect the input from that consortium of inputs and specialty people. The next stage in the process, obviously, is to refine that and to nail that down in terms of even more detail.
Okay, anybody else want to add to that from the officer's point of view or consultant's point of view?
Yes, I'd like to add to it. And when we were looking at the land use options, we did look at a number of different options in the area, and there's quite a number that were assessed. And initially we had looked at the costing based around a lucerne type crop. And there was a level of consultation with farmers in the area, and they had flagged up, they felt that, that was on the optimistic side. And so we did take that into account, and we did reduce it down so it was more based around a grass cut and carry to be a bit more of a conservative approach on that return. So that feedback was taken into consideration.
Okay. That's my final question, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Okay. Back to you, Councillor Barrett, for second round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My other questions have been picked up on the way through, so back to you. Thank you.
Good. Okay, second round of questions. Councillor Hancock.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I just want to perhaps get a little bit more detail just around adaptive management. 760 hectares is the minimum in terms of actually starting to reduce our flows into the Manawatu River. So I suspect that adaptive management will have some unknown or hidden costs. For example, more land acquisition, additional infrastructure, and construction of wetlands. So can I just get some comment around project creep in terms of the costings already given?
Jim may want to add, through you, Mr. Chair, some more detail, but the key to active management being a consentable part of the application is that there's sufficient detail in there that allows the consenting authority to have confidence that we actually have a deliverable plan as opposed to a dream. So to that extent, there should not be undefined project creep, if I can call it that, Councillor, in the sense that it would be clearly defined that the next stage in the process, once you reached a growth of X, that you would need to get additional land area Y, and estimated costs can then be defined. So you would know, what the scope would be and roughly what the timeframes would be based on the KPIs of those timeframes. As opposed, it may not be just a geographic chronological timeframe. It depends on the growth rate or whatever. So I think there will be boundaries around that as opposed to just general scope creep. The advantage of the approach is that you're not building something today that is to meet a projected 35-year growth program, which would, the flip side of that would be gross overcapitalisation in terms of the city and the current funders, because it would be significantly oversized relative to what the demand would be for the first few years or first few decades.
And yes, if I can pick up on that, David, the adaptive management in terms of the land, the strength would be in the consent conditions, not only in monitoring growth against land area, etc., but in the water quality, the ecology monitoring, and the annual and quarterly, if it's quarterly, reporting through to horizons. Adaptive management, an example I've seen of land application is the nitrogen level in the groundwater in bores. And if a certain trigger is hit from that, it automatically triggers in a set of actions needed, more monitoring, next level, more land, etc. And the process clicks in on the trigger levels that are enshrined in the resource consent conditions. So that's how that approach leads. And just while we're talking about areas of land, these are gross areas with a provision of 30% for buffers, etc. Once specific sites were targeted in, that becomes a more rational decision on what the buffers need to be. But just highlighting that trigger level approach and having certainty in the consent conditions. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Dennison, you've got your hand up again.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't take it down from last time. My error.
Right.
So,
okay,
sorry, Grant, can I just follow up?
Sorry,
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, sorry, Mr. Mayor. Can I just follow up on that? The answers provided. I suppose under option 2, which has got an NPV of $496 million. That's predicated on 760 hectares, and that is, I guess, to achieve a consentable reduction in wastewater going to the Manawatu River. So my understanding is that for us to actually decrease the amount of wastewater going to the river, what we would have to do then is increase the amount of land that we then use, which of course that would increase the NPV considerably.
Or use the adaptive management program of increased technology, other reuses. Would that be right, David?
Yeah, what we're saying at the moment, Councillor, is that based on today and the requirements for 35 years' time, that's what you would need. Based on the principles that we're recommending, we will sit down now and then say, how would you refine this over time to meet the growth and trigger levels as you move it into a consenting program? So the land area required on day one may be less. We may use a larger wetland, for example, as part of the deal that would reduce it. We may have some technology changes upstream that would reduce it. So it will change over time. What you're saying is for the initial comparative process, we basically took, as we had to, everybody had to meet a standard for a 35-year option to give us some comparative options. Our trigger now, or our guidelines now, is to actually sit down and look at that mix and match and say, how do we make this A, consentable, and B, what is the appropriate delivery timeline for the different components to achieve what can be done in terms of treatment and further growth components into the overall system for a consentable 35-year consent. That's what we're targeting.
Thank you.
And of course, I'm saying it's all based on today's dollars. I mean, if we decide to do something in 20 years' time as part of the process, the actual dollar number may change depending on, inflation rates and cost increases.
Okay, councillors, there's no more hands up. So thank you. We've got through those questions. Thank you to the officers and the technical team. And the chair of the BPO. So councillors, we've got some recommendations there from the officers' report. It's on page 13 of your papers. There's 3 recommendations there. I'm happy to move them. There's clearly some questioning that's bringing forward, and I think the technical team and certainly the chair has picked up that council, or some of the questioning was about how we move to a greater option, getting out of the river more, and that's been teased out pretty well with some of the questions and then some of the answers. So we've got the resolutions there. I'm happy to move those. The Deputy Mayor indicated that she would second those. I'll just read them. That Council resolves that Council receives the report titled the Wastewater Best Practical Option Final Assessment and BPO Selection, including the attachments appendices 1 to 10. Number 2, that the Council note the best practical option BPO identified by the technical team for consideration by Council based on officer recommendations of scoring and weighting of the assessment criteria. That Council agree the assessment weightings for determining the wastewater management solution are as set out in Figure 3, technical recommendation of assessment weightings. So councillors, this is 3 years of work, and it does seem quite odd that we are online doing this, but we are in a time frame window, and I think our legal team have given us a pretty good steer on why we need to push on with this. I just want to touch on what the recommendations were there around option 2, with some movement, staged movement to options 6 and 7. I think we have to be mindful of what technology can do. Those that came on the original wastewater tour, if you could remember, almost 2.5 years ago now, when we went to Rotorua, they had a very different way of what they were going to do to what they're doing now, and that is deemed by technology. The membrane system, that's sort of what they call that level 4 system, technology has become enhanced and also more affordable. I think we're going to find that with our best practical option as well. So that's where that adaptive management program comes in, and it does need to be locked into any consent, which enables improvements and clip-ons with technology, getting out of the river, better reuse. In fact, I wrote down some words here from Chris Teo-Sherrell's report that use it as a resource. So whether it is used on our parks, on our race courses, on some of our pathways, etc., and limiting that use up the pipe, at the source. So there are other ways of doing things rather than just buying a whole lot more land, which ultimately would effectively destroy our neighbours' agricultural sector as well. I do think there's a real opportunity here as technology gets better and better. Also, the different cropping and plant crops that we can grow here. So it just isn't a cut and carry, which the farming community have signalled to us is possibly going to be a limited area. But also bringing iwi with us. We've done a lot with iwi, obviously our mana whenua, but also our wider iwi neighbours, and I think that's where we've really got some traction in understanding their values, their whole MCA process as well. And I think the officers have indicated it would be foolish not to be going or bringing everybody in a group together. So look, I'll leave it at that. I do think that the best treatment possible came through just in about every meeting I was at, and that got louder and louder, that voice, the closer we got to today. And I think the officers have done a good job in picking up on that. That definitely was the preferred choice of iwi as well, but also our farming community, our other stakeholder groups, our environmental groups as well. The challenge will be paying for all of this, and it is eye-watering numbers. But do remember, everything that we've put in here has no external money. As we know, that must come from somewhere. and to make this truly affordable for everybody. So I'll leave it at that. I'll open it up now for any other comments.
Mr. Mayor, I was just wondering if you're going to break at midday, because I'd imagine there'd be a few of us wanting to speak. You did outline we'd break now and maybe have lunch and come back for the second innings, if that makes sense.
Yep, I'm heading towards that, councillor, but I haven't, other than you commenting about that, there is no other people in the chat box, unless I'm missing something. Okay, so Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just first off, want to acknowledge you and our other members on the steering group that really did the hard yards on the public consultation round. There's so many meetings and covered so much key stakeholder groups. You really put in an extended effort to represent us as the council. So thank you. My thoughts are that to get to this point, I've still found that some of the assumptions are still a big best guess being acknowledged as being part of putting it together. And I would have thought a few years back that we would have been further down the track and actually getting a lot more specific and clear on what the costs were going to be and what some of the actual practical options, limitations were. There are the limitations being acknowledged, and I mentioned around even the soil quality. I think that's the fundamental to the success of that. And to get the size land that we're talking about as an inland option, knowing that the land around this region is not well drained, is problematic. And so therefore, I think even when we were talking about the sandier soils, it seemed more likely to get an outcome there, but yet those options are being eliminated because of the various weighting and various ranking. And I can appreciate that. So that's one concern around the costings, and whether the weightings and the weighting for cost, knowing that the financial viability of this whole project is quite important. And I don't want to personally just leave it to the Three Waters reform, leaving us with no option but to pass over our assets to the new water entity. I still want to have a confidence that what we move forward on is actually financially affordable for our city. And at the moment, going to some of those larger options is really restricting. So the weighting that we've got currently at 10%, I think might be too light. That's my first point, and I'd be open to any recommendations to maybe lift that in recognition of my concern around that point. Secondly, we talked about the difference between iwi or Māori having a weighting much higher than the community voice in the situation. And so I understand that there was a wide range of the stakeholder and community feedback, and that there was some that was so varied that it was hard to try and capture a clear voice out of that. But even so, the misbalancing of that with the Māori values being at 20%, I want to flag that as well as being something that I'd like to be open to debate around whether that's enough support to tweak that somewhat to bring that closer in alignment. That would be my second point. So in summary, I think it's the costings. I'm still have a number of concerns around the assumptions and what the blowouts actually might be. The choice on the soil qualities and the price of acquiring land, and even the concern around needing to use the Public Works Act to acquire it, are all red flags for me around the land discharge. I'm happy with progressing option 2, though. I think option 2 makes a lot of sense in what you presented and what's been put forward in all the reports. My I guess, openness to go to the option 7 with the 43% going to land. I feel that's more favourable to get us through the RMA process, but as long as if we were able to remodel the financial costings to still make that a viable option for us moving forward, that could still have my support. So that's my summary comments for this debate, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Look, I just David Warburton, did you want to just reply? Was there's something there? A question?
Thank you, Grant. The only thing that I would just flag for councillors to think about is when they want to increase a weighting on a particular option, they may also want to think about which of the options they want to de-weight, because you can't just keep adding, you've got to subtract something somewhere. So in terms of running the options, when you're thinking about doing that, and that's why we built the model, so councillors could in fact have this input and see what the benefit and how things change, you also need to say, if I want one up by 20%, I want something else to go down by 5, 20, whatever percent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Yeah, thank you. Following on from Councillor Dennison's comments, I think also I would like to see the costings given additional weight. I mean, it does have to be practicable, and for it to only be weighted at 10%, I don't think really acknowledges the impact of the significance of the cost on our community. Looking at all of the other 6 aspects, there's a lot of duplication of issues. There's a lot of issues that go across a number of those, elements. And certainly I'd be happy to increase the comparative cost to around 25 or 30%. And look to reduce some of those other by about 5%. I've put something in the chat that would achieve that. If that needs to be happen in a way of an amendment, I'd certainly be happy to support that. But also happy to hear others' comments. I'm not quite sure how quickly you're wanting to get to the third recommendation, or how you want to deal with any potential changes. But certainly, I think we have underdone that element, and how it's financed and how it's funded is, I mean, I know there's a lot of moving parts in terms of the three waters, but whichever way you look at it, even if we do hand over the cost of this to another entity, it is our community that will need to be paying for it and through one bill or another. So I think it needs to be given significance in terms of weighting at the moment.
So councillors, I've moved the recommendations, so they're on the as they were on the screen before, and they're seconded. So as they are at the moment, to change any of that, you'll need to put an amendment up. So we're just going through. And remember, if you are going to change any of the weightings, you've got to think clearly about. You just can't add. You've got to take them off somewhere else.
Okay. So perhaps just to be a little bit more specific, I have popped in the chat the other elements. So on page on page, I think it was 81 of the long report, the costs, there was an example of where cost was given additional weighting, and that was a 40%, I think. But just to adjust the MCA down from 15 to 10%, the project objectives down from 25 to 20%, and the RMA planning from 20% to 15%, that would give us an additional 15% to increase the costings to 25%.
Councillor, before we go any further, is there a seconder to that? Okay, there is none. So we'll
Sorry,
continue.
Mr. Mayor. Can I just clarify, Karen? What the percentage of lift in the costing weighting what you was proposing?
25% to the costing, to the comparative cost, moving that from 10% to 25%. So then that's an additional 15%, and then taking 5% off 3 of the other elements, 5% off MCA, 5% off project objectives, and 5% off RMA planning. I have popped that in the chat if anyone wants to look at it.
Yeah. I'm happy to second that, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, well, we're going to have to take that as an amendment. So if you just give the team, and I'll go to Sarah, if we could get that up. So it's around so it needs to probably be saying increase weighting of cost to 25% and reduce the 3 others, MCA, project objectives and RMA, 3 others by 5%. That's moved by Councillor Naylor, seconded by Councillor Dennison, and this is where it gets a little bit difficult. We can only, I'll allow people to speak to this one if they can. So if you can take your hands down if you're not speaking to this amendment. And David, you got your hand up. Are you wanting to just advise on that to that question that's been, amendment that's just been thrown up?
With your indulgence, Mr. Mayor, I'd just like to remind councillors, in case they've missed it with the amount of information, that costings is a component in the MCA analysis. So you will, by moving that, you will actually remove some of the costing components in the MCA because it is part of that mix. And secondly, outside those weightings, when you go to the BPO process, you will see that comparative financial implications are one of the key components in the BPO process, which is the next stage in the program. So whatever you do on those weightings at the front end of what we call the arms of the octopus, you've still got costings as one of the key components in the BPO process that we have to comply with under the Resource Management Act, our consent requirements. And you will recall that none of those were weighted one way or the other. They are as they came out. So remember that the costings are occurring in other places. Purely a point of information, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I've got 2 councillors that want to speak to this, and then I'll come back to you, Councillor Naylor. So Councillor Dingwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will not be supporting this amendment because I would find it immensely disrespectful to put cost above the views of Maori views at the moment. And in fact, if that failed, I would be putting up an amendment to increase the weighting of Maori values to 50% as indicated on page 20 of the assessment recommendations that we have in our pack. And it's mainly because I do think it's really, really vital that we pay attention to our Te partnership and actually try and go forward with a bit more of a 50-50 kind of a view. And I feel like reducing all the other options, I would not want to see cost being more important than listening to our iwi partners. And we know that, I mean, this kind of goes into, I guess, all of my points of view, but I might as well say it now if you allow me, and then I don't have to say it again. But we are in a period of change at the moment. We know that more people are aware of our Te obligations. We know that more people are aware of our climate change obligations. We know that the central government's 3 waters thing is happening sort of in the background. And if they end up going with a 50-50 partnership, where does that leave all of our discussions if we haven't factored that in as well? Moreover, it's really difficult for iwi to engage with our processes and things if we're going to say, right, you will now get 20% of the overall assessments. I feel like that's not playing an even playing field. So I would not support that amendment, and if that failed, I would be putting up my own amendment to increase the weighting for Māori as it is in our papers.
Okay, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. So I'm not going to be supporting this amendment, and just in general, I want to caution fellow elected members about fiddling with the weightings. What we've got here is the end of years of work and a substantial amount of technical expertise that's been presented to us, and none of us sitting around the decision-making table are experts in wastewater. We might know a bit more about it now than we did 4 years ago, but we're not experts. And I think we need to be very, very cautious about making political interference in the weightings and the outcomes of this very technical and detailed process. I certainly don't support elevating costs to 25%, primarily because the community indicated that cost was not the most important factor to them. The community indicated that the most important factor to them were things like the effect on the environment, the aspect of how well the wastewater was treated, etc. And cost was not a significant determining factor for the majority of the people that respond in those community engagements. But over and above that, when I hear Councillor Dingwall suggesting that she's going to put forward another change to the weightings, and no doubt other people have got changes to weightings up their sleeves, I just counsel you all to be very, very cautious. This is a very technical and complicated business in which we have engaged experts to advise us. And there's got to be a very good and strong reason for going against the advice of experts in this. And so I just counsel you all to be very cautious in coming up with these amendments to change weightings. Whatever you might personally think is the most important thing, this, at the end of the day, has to go through an RMA process. It has to be consentable, and political whim is not really what we need here. It's some sensible, logical heads and evidence-based decision making. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm going to just say a few things as well. Look, councillors, I totally agree with Councillor Johnson. If we start trying to pull all these levers in any different way, it will. This is political. We've employed a technical team. They've been working on this for 3 years. There's a number of us that have represented your views on that BPO group. And look, I get people want to push up Māori values or push up the cost to try and pull down another lever. I get all of that, but actually that's already been embedded right throughout multiple assessments and actually in the BPO itself. So fiddling with it at the 11th hour, I think will be quite problematic in the RMA process and will be seen as political manipulation. So please, I urge you to think about that when you vote on this. Now, we just go back to others that have wanted to speak. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to briefly speak to this, my views reasonably aligned with where you're coming from and where Councillor Johnson are coming from on this, and that in general we do have to think carefully about wading into things from this end. I do think there's some rationale around the 50-50 approach that we see coming through the three waters, and at least asking the question of what it would look like if we were to apply that through our process. And it might be, I don't know if it's possible for that to get worked up over lunch so we could have an understanding of what those balances might be. But look, I suppose my main reflection really from the morning's work so far, and now early into the afternoon, is that from the project team there has been a quite comprehensive effort through the weightings and through the underlying technical analysis, which has given us the clear indication of a starting point for a BPO. And the thing that I've heard this morning is that where we could benefit from some clarity is an understanding of the level of, I guess, direction of travel and level of ambition between option 2 and how we're getting to option 6 and 7, and providing some clarity in that space. And I'd be quite keen for us to lend some of the debate this afternoon to that and have a recommendation that could help bring some clarity into that space. But in terms of this recommendation, I'm generally not supportive of it, again, on the basis of going into a reweightings that has been principally developed through an expert basis. And I think, to me, the only possible reweighting that we might consider would be one that provides us high alignment with the Three Waters governance and with Te Tiriti, which is a 50-50 weighting. But beyond that, I think we're probably delving into technical rather than our role. Thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think when on my first reading of the papers, I was quite surprised to see cost at 10%, and probably on that first reading would have supported looking to increase that, because I certainly have heard that concern from our community. It might not have come through super strongly in the stakeholder feedback that we're referencing today, but there is a concern about the affordability and the huge numbers that we're talking about. But having said that, probably my further reflection on getting into the hundreds of pages of reports, and probably from Mr. Warburton's comments as well, is that I was convinced to leave it where it is, I suppose, by the way that cost is reflected into some of the other weightings, that the elements that are weighted for us. Some of those portmanteau weightings, like the MCA, the project objectives, they cover a multitude of different elements. And so I feel that costing is at 10% in one element, but brought through in other elements as well. And I'd probably say the same comment on things like mana whenua input, is that it doesn't just sit in one space, it flows through all of the others. And so my reflection is that on balance, I feel comfortable with where we are now, recognising that the wise words that we've heard is that I'm not an expert in any of this, and we've paid a great deal of money to people who are to give us their best advice. And so I'll be sitting with that, at least for the time being. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just reminding everybody that we're speaking to the amendment. The Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll just be brief, because I agree with a lot of the comments that Councillor Johnson made. So I won't be supporting the amendment. I am confident that there's been ample opportunity to, or mechanisms to be able to influence or give direction to where we want the weightings to sit. And whilst through the questions I asked earlier, you might have connected some dots that I'm not entirely comfortable with the weightings that are given. That is the expert advice that we have received. We councillors will recall that this conversation around endorsing, I guess, weightings was actually scheduled to be in a workshop, and we determined that in actual fact it wasn't the role of elected members to influence weightings in a way that would change the experts' outcomes, that there is a process, and part of that includes hearing what their advice is. And so we determined that in actual fact that we were leaving that to professionals who were qualified in this space, and that we would hear what they had to say. So whilst I don't entirely agree with it, because I would have liked to have seen more weighting given to other areas. I am accepting that actually that's the decision that we made, and if we wanted to determine the weightings ourselves, then we would have had that conversation. But actually we agreed to decline that opportunity and accept the advice of the professionals, and then to essentially get to this point we would endorse it to go to the next stage. So I've got concerns that if we are running the numbers and wanting a particular option to come out more favourable, then all we need to do is actually adjust the weightings in a particular direction, and what we're trying to do is actually avoid that process. So I won't support this. I won't support the I guess alternative amendment that's been signalled by Councillor Dingwall, and any that may come up that actually amend weightings. I'll be voting against all of those.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Having sat on the steering group, I am confident that the process we've been through in the last 3 years is robust, and certainly do not want councillors tweaking away with weightings just because of personal preferences. As far as the financials go, this project is hundreds of millions of dollars. And the concern I've heard from the community about the cost is not over a specific option, is the fact that the project, whatever option we choose, is going to be hundreds of millions of dollars. And at this point the Three Waters has not been decided, so we don't know where we're going. It's not in legislation, so anything that might be in the future. So we don't actually know at this point of where the assets are going, or where actually we as a council might be able to knock on government's doors to actually get funding for the right option. So there's still, you know, some decisions to be made about how this is going to be funded. So I certainly will not be supporting any tweaking on any of the weightings. I'm comfortable we've done this through all the workshops. I mean, if people remember in the actual MCA workshop that we did, I think that was about a year or so ago now, we actually took the financial weighting completely out, and then we put it in at 50 to 60%. And actually it didn't change very much in any of the actual order of the options. So definitely will not consider tweaking of any of those weightings. So thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, that's back to you, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, and I certainly appreciate hearing the perspectives of you all. I think there's a few things I'd like to say. Firstly, the understanding of the process that we're in. There's been comments made about, you know, we shouldn't be fiddling with the weightings at the 11th hour, and, you know, we made a decision to leave it up to the experts in terms of the weighting. That's not my recollection of the discussion we had. The discussion we had to have this discussion potentially in public, which this is as public as you get under level 4 lockdown, I guess, as opposed to a workshop, was actually to ensure transparency of decision making. It wasn't for us to advocate a position where we were just going to let the experts decide for us and then we'll just rubber stamp that. It was about us saying, no, we don't want to have those conversations in a workshop. We want to have those conversations in public, where the decision-making process is transparent, the reasons for our views and our thinking is transparent, and the reasons for our decision is there for anyone to see who wishes to know how we got to what we got to. That is the reason that we're doing this here and now and not in a workshop. That is my understanding of it. So in terms of saying we shouldn't be fiddling with the weightings now, actually now is the time for us to determine the weightings. So now is that time. It's not that that's already been decided in the past and now we're fiddling with it. It's actually that now is the time for us to determine that. And I've got huge respect for the work that's been done over the last 3 years. I've got huge respect for the technical input from many, many people. And I've got a lot of respect for all of those who have contributed to the process thus far. But I do disagree with the comment that we're not the experts. And in actual fact, we are the experts on hearing and advocating for the needs and views of our community. And there are many people in our community where this process is not even something that they would think to be able to engage with. It's a highly technical, a huge amount of information to process. And certainly there have been pockets of people in our community who have engaged with it. But the majority of our community, the main way that they will engage with it is at the other end when they actually have to pay for it. So it's for that reason that I don't hold back. I don't apologise at all for advocating strongly for us to weight that more significantly at this point. I mean, I think 10% is an extremely low percentage to weight it when the impact of that on so many people in our community will be significant. And certainly I haven't gone and tweaked numbers and done the equations. I've simply looked at I've read through, I'm aware that the examples that gave did change the order around a little bit. But ultimately, I hear from colleagues that it may not be supported, but I'm really happy to put it out there, my reasons for advocating for a higher percentage for the financial weighting. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Look, I'm going to ask for a division on this, and I've already. So Hannah, we've spoken about how we're going to do this. You are going to carry out that role as governance manager. Is that correct? Thank you. All right, I'll leave it in your hands now.
Okay, I'll call the name of the councillors. So if you could turn.
Sorry, Hannah, your audio is quite light.
I will try again. Is that better? Is that working better?
Can you can you speak to us again?
Can you hear me now?
You just check if you're up on full volume. We can hear you just, yes.
Okay, I'll speak louder. Sorry about that. I'll adjust that over the break.
That's better.
So I'm going to read the names of the councillors. So if they could take their microphone, because this will be not in an order that you're expecting, it's random. If you could give me your answer and then whether you're for or against, and then I will give you the result at the end of that. So first up, Councillor Finlay.
Against.
Against. Councillor Meehan.
Against.
Against. Thank you. Councillor Beatty.
Against.
Against. Councillor Butt.
Against.
Against. Thank you. Councillor Bowen.
Against.
Against. Councillor Naylor.
For.
For. Councillor Dennison.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Hancock.
Against.
Against. Mayor Smith.
Against.
Against. Councillor Barrett.
Against.
Thank you. Councillor Dingwall.
Against.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Rutherford.
Against.
Against. Councillor Johnson.
Against.
Against. Councillor Harpeter.
Against.
Against. Councillor McCallard.
Against.
Against. Thank you. So that is 2 votes for, 13 votes against, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. All right. That has failed. Look, we've run on, and I know people want to speak to the wider recommendations, so we're going to break. Now, I understand there may be some other, because there was signalled some possible other amendments. If you're going to do that, one, you need a seconder. Otherwise, they just won't get across the line. And I would stress that you send those to myself as the chair and the governance manager, Hannah. Put them perhaps in the chat box as well. And we will need a little bit of extra time to process any of those. I'm hoping there's not many, but look, we're now at 12:34. I think that we'll come back at 1:45. Just allows a little bit of time for any of those amendments to be brought up on screen and checked through. So 1:45, back here, councillors and our technical team and officers, and we'll see you then. Thank you.
Are you closing it down, Grant?
Look, because it's such a long time, yes, but we're just up to you. You can stay online, just turn it off, turn your video off, and just keep online if you want to. If you've got other work to do, then just log back on. Just give yourself a bit. Just don't all log on at 1:45. Okay, we'll see you then.
Yeah.
Karen and